It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Nothing more than a quiet escape from the buzzing world of work and technology. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. A solo camping trip at Deer Creek. The place was about a 2-hour drive from the city, deep into a patch of forest that I had come across in a hiking forum a while ago. I liked the idea of being alone out there, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional bird chirping. A chance to reset and clear my head. No phone signal, no distractions. Just me and the wilderness. I parked my car by the trailhead. The sound of the gravel crunching under the tires was the last reminder of civilization before I started walking down the path. The air was crisp, a light breeze cutting through the trees, sending leaves scattering across the dirt trail. The sun was low, casting a warm glow through the branches. It was the perfect kind of weather, not too hot, not too cold. I slung my backpack over my shoulder, adjusting the straps as I set off into the woods. The trail was narrow but well-marked. A few scattered footprints told me I wasn't the only one to use it recently. There were no other cars at the trailhead, though, which was exactly what I was hoping for. I liked the thought of solitude, of being completely alone for a while. As I walked, I noticed the forest around me gradually getting thicker. The trees were old, tall pines, their trunks thick with age. The kind of trees that make you feel small, insignificant. I couldn't help but admire them as I continued along, the trail snaking its way deeper into the woods. The hours passed quickly. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was nearly gone. The forest had grown darker, the shadows stretching longer and longer. There was a small clearing by the creek where I had planned to set up my tent. The creek was more of a small stream, its water trickling over rocks with a soothing sound. I found a good spot to pitch the tent, just a few feet from the creek's edge, where the sound of water would lull me to sleep. I hadn't seen a single other person since I set off. It was exactly what I wanted. Setting up camp didn't take long. I unrolled the tent, staked it down, and arranged my things inside. The fire pit was already there, a few stones forming a circle around the place where the fire would go. The wood was dry, which I appreciated. The last thing I wanted was to struggle with wet logs or damp matches. I got the fire going quickly, and soon the flames were dancing in the night, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. As the fire crackled, I sat back and watched the sky darken. There was no light pollution here, and the stars came out in full force. Felt peaceful, like I was the only one in the world. I could hear the water flowing gently in the creek, the occasional rustle of a small animal moving in the underbrush. It was the kind of quiet that I could never find in the city, and it was exactly what I needed. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. It was subtle at first, like a whisper in the back of my mind. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I felt watched. It was the same feeling you get when you're walking down an empty street and suddenly feel like someone's behind you, even though you know there's no one there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone out here in the woods. There was no one around for miles. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. I kept my gaze on the fire, focusing on the warmth and the light. But the shadows in the trees, they seemed darker now, deeper than before. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my heart skip a beat. I tried to tell myself it was just the normal sounds of the forest at night. Animals moving around, the wind shifting. But something in my gut told me it was more than that. I decided to go for a short walk, hoping it would calm my nerves. Maybe a change of scenery would help me shake the feeling. I grabbed my flashlight and wandered a little ways away from camp, keeping the creek to my left. The beam of the flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating the trees and the ground in front of me. Every so often, I would stop and listen. The woods were eerily quiet, too quiet. I found myself walking farther than I intended. My feet carried me deeper into the forest without me even realizing it. I had no sense of how much time had passed, but when I finally stopped and looked around, I realized I had strayed pretty far from camp. The path had disappeared, and the forest seemed to grow even darker. I flicked the flashlight off, listening for any sounds to give me a clue of my surroundings. But there was nothing, not even the soft rush of wind through the trees. I turned around, but when I shone the light back the way I had come, everything looked different. The trees were denser, their branches twisting into strange shapes. The creek, which I had been following, was gone. I felt a chill run down my spine. I retraced my steps, or at least I thought I was, but nothing seemed familiar. The forest had transformed into a maze of trees and shadows. The night felt thicker now, the air heavy. I walked in circles, panic beginning to claw at my chest. The silence was suffocating, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch underfoot, made my breath hitch. I knew I had to get back to camp. I couldn't afford to get lost out here, not in the dark. But the more I walked, the more I realized I had no idea which direction to go. My flashlight beam darted across the trees, trying to make sense of the world around me, but it all looked the same. It was like the forest was closing in on me, swallowing me whole. Eventually, I found something familiar, a large rock by the base of a tree, one I remembered seeing earlier. I breathed a sigh of relief and made my way toward it. But when I got closer, something caught my eye, a set of footprints. Large, heavy prints, too big to be mine. They were fresh, deep in the soft dirt. I froze, my mind racing. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and now here were these prints, leading off into the trees. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Someone or something was out there. I turned around, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I had to get back to camp. I had to get back now. The walk back was nothing like the one I'd made earlier. Every turn I took felt wrong. The trees were unfamiliar, the path lost. I didn't know how much time had passed, but I was starting to panic. The shadows seemed to stretch further than they should. The once comforting sound of the creek was absent now, replaced by an oppressive silence. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled back to camp. The tent was still standing, the fire was dim, but there was no sign of anyone else. I collapsed by the fire, my heart racing, my body drenched in sweat. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to calm myself. As the night stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. I stayed by the fire, the only thing that felt safe. I made sure to keep it burning bright, feeding it with fresh wood every now and then. The shadows danced around me, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. At some point, the sounds of the forest returned. Distant calls of animals, the rustle of the wind through the trees. I must have eventually fallen asleep because when I woke up, the sun was already rising, casting light through the trees and warming the cool air. I packed up my things quietly, not daring to look back. The forest felt less oppressive in the daylight, but the memory of the footprints still haunted me. I knew I'd never come back to Deer Creek, not after that night. As I walked back to the trailhead, the normal sounds of the forest surrounded me. Birds singing, squirrels scampering across branches. The world felt normal again, but I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. I made it back to my car, and when I looked in the rearview mirror one last time before driving away, I swear I saw something move in the trees behind me. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, or maybe it was something more. But I never found out. I wasn't about to stay and figure it out. I drove home in silence, the sound of the tires on the asphalt the only thing keeping me grounded. I had always loved the outdoors. Growing up, My family made a tradition out of camping in the woods, far away from the chaos of city life. The air was always fresh, the sounds of nature were calming, and there was a simple peace in knowing that you were part of something bigger. This time, though, it was different. I decided to go camping by myself. No family, no friends, just me and the forest. The plan was simple. Find a quiet, secluded spot in the woods, set up my tent, and spend a few days disconnected from everything. No phone, no distractions. Just the wilderness and me. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. I packed my gear, checked the weather, and drove out of town early one Saturday morning. The drive was peaceful, the roads winding through endless trees and small streams. I was heading into an area I knew well, a national forest that had always felt safe and familiar. The trail I was aiming for was known for being remote, which was exactly what I wanted. I could feel the tension of daily life start to slip away as I got deeper into the woods. I parked my car at the trailhead and unloaded my gear. The sun was high in the sky, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt good to be out here, away from the noise and stress of everyday life. I should have known, though, that sometimes the quietest places can hold the most unsettling secrets. As I made my way deeper into the forest, the sounds of the world around me seemed to grow softer, and the air became cooler. The sunlight filtered through the trees and beams, creating strange patterns on the forest floor. I followed a narrow path that led me to a clearing where I decided to set up camp. It was perfect. A small creek ran nearby, and the trees around me created a natural barrier, providing both shelter and privacy. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and sat down by the creek, feeling the cool water rush past my legs. There was something peaceful about the sound of the water. It was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. As the sun began to set, I started a fire and roasted a simple meal. The crackling of the flames was the only sound that filled the air. It was exactly what I had hoped for. No noise, no interruptions. Just me, the fire, and the woods. The night came quickly, and with it, the forest transformed. The warmth of the fire was comforting, but the dark trees surrounding me seemed to stretch further and further into the unknown. The sounds of the forest at night were different from the daytime. The chirping of birds was replaced by the rustling of small creatures moving through the underbrush. The wind picked up, and I could hear it howling through the branches above, but it wasn't a calming sound like it usually was. It felt tense, almost as if something was watching me from the shadows. I shrugged it off, telling myself that it was just my imagination. After all, I had been camping alone before. This was nothing new. I stoked the fire, making sure it was strong enough to ward off any animals that might be lurking nearby. The last thing I wanted was a curious bear or mountain lion sniffing around my camp. I crawled into my tent, wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, and tried to get some rest. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound outside the tent seemed amplified in the quiet night. The crack of a twig breaking, the rustle of leaves, each sound set my nerves on edge. I kept telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that this was just the normal noises of the forest. Then I heard something different. It was a low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. It wasn't the usual rustling of animals. This sound was deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't an animal, that much was certain. No creature made that kind of noise. It was almost as if someone or something was moving through the forest, dragging its feet along the earth. I held my breath, trying to listen more carefully. The sound came again, closer this time. My eyes darted around the inside of the tent. I didn't want to peek out and risk seeing something I couldn't unsee. I tried to tell myself that it was just a trick of the wind, that the sound was just the trees shifting, or maybe a branch caught on something. But it wasn't. The sound continued, growing louder. It was unmistakable now. Someone or something was out there. I knew I had to do something. But what? I couldn't stay in the tent all night, not with that sound getting closer. Slowly, I unzipped the tent flap, careful not to make a sound. I peeked out into the dark forest. The firelight barely illuminated the area around my campsite, casting long, eerie shadows across the trees and rocks. I saw nothing, but the sound was still there, dragging closer. My heart was racing in my chest, and every instinct in me screamed to run, to pack up and leave, but I couldn't. I wasn't sure why. There was something holding me in place, as if I needed to know what was out there. I couldn't explain it, but the fear wasn't enough to make me turn and go back. The dragging noise came again, closer still, and then a voice. It wasn't a voice I could make out. It was low and guttural, like someone struggling to speak, but the words were unintelligible. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. I couldn't just stay there. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, but there was nothing, only shadows. Then, I heard a rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, human footsteps. They were coming from the direction of the creek, slowly but steadily, getting closer. I snapped the flashlight off, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I had to make a decision. Do I stay here where I might be in danger, or do I leave now and risk getting lost in the dark? My mind raced through the possibilities, but before I could come to any conclusion, I heard the sound again, the dragging noise, followed by the guttural voice. This time it was right outside my tent. I could see the faint shape of something in the darkness. It was tall and broad, its form just barely visible in the shadows. It wasn't a person. It was too wrong. Panic surged through me as I grabbed my backpack, my flashlight, and whatever gear I could carry. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it was. I bolted from the tent, running into the forest, not looking back. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of something following me, no, chasing me, grew louder, the dragging noise almost rhythmic now. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Every step felt like an eternity. The flashlight bounced in my hand, casting wild, disorienting beams of light through the trees. I stumbled, tripping over a root, but I didn't stop, couldn't. The noise behind me was growing closer. The footsteps, the dragging, the low, incomprehensible voice. It was all too much. I ran until my legs burned, until I couldn't hear the noise anymore. Only then did I dare to stop and look around. I was far from my campsite now, deep in the forest. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow on the ground. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to catch my breath. I was alone.
No dragging.
No voice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, huddled under a tree, my senses on high alert. The morning came slowly, and with it, the usual sounds of the forest. Birds singing, leaves rustling in the wind. But I didn't trust it. I didn't trust the silence that had descended on my camp. I didn't go back. I walked for hours, heading toward the trailhead where I knew I could get back to my car. But I didn't look back. I didn't stop. And when I finally reached my car, I drove home without a second thought. I never went camping alone again. The wind was cold, sharper than it had been when we first started our hike up the trail. The kind of cold that made you shiver even when you weren't moving, and made your fingers stiff despite the gloves. I had always enjoyed hiking, the quiet of the forest, the smell of pine, and the thrill of being out in nature with nothing but the bare essentials, just the way I liked it. This was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me, the woods, and the sound of a campfire crackling as night fell. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The forest was dense up here, thick with trees that blocked out most of the daylight. The sun was setting, casting everything in a fading orange glow. As I hiked along, the trail winding through the trees, I could feel the weight of the silence around me. It wasn't the usual calming silence I was used to when out camping. This felt different, more intense, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I had been on this trail before, so I knew it well. But something about the way the wind rustled the leaves, the way the branches creaked in the distance, it just wasn't right. There was a faint buzzing in the air, like static electricity, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but the feeling lingered. After a few more miles, I reached the clearing where I'd planned to set up camp. A small brook trickled nearby, and there was a flat spot for the tent. I unpacked my gear, setting up the tent and gathering firewood. The sun was nearly gone, and I needed the fire to stave off the creeping cold. As the fire started to crackle, I felt a bit of comfort, watching the flames flicker and dance in the growing darkness. But the sense of unease didn't go away. The forest had grown quieter, too quiet. The usual night sounds, crickets, owls, rustling animals, were nowhere to be heard. There was just that same oppressive silence that pressed in on me from every direction. I glanced around, half expecting someone or something to emerge from the shadows. I didn't know why I was so on edge. I had camped alone plenty of times before, but tonight felt different. It wasn't long before I noticed it. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks again, but when I looked up, I saw a shadow at the edge of the clearing. It was just outside the reach of the firelight, tall and thin, standing still like it was watching me. I froze, unsure of what to do. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel it there, just out of sight, waiting. For what? I wasn't sure. I grabbed my flashlight, trying to steady my breathing as I shone the light in the direction of the shadow. But when the beam hit the trees, there was nothing there. Just the blackness of the forest, stretching on forever. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe it had just been a trick of the light, a branch swaying in the breeze that made it look like something else. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I didn't feel safe anymore. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that it was just the isolation getting to me. I told myself to go to bed, to lock the tent, and just sleep. But every sound, every crack and pop from the fire, every rustle of the leaves, it all made me jump. I lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, listening for anything that didn't belong. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like footsteps crunching in the leaves. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. I held my breath, listening intently. The sound got closer, moving toward my camp. I grabbed the flashlight again, my fingers trembling as I flicked it on. The beam swept through the trees, but again, there was nothing. The rustling stopped. For a moment, the air felt still again, but the uneasy feeling in my chest had only grown. My instincts told me to pack up and leave, but the rational part of me said it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature. There was nothing to worry about, nothing at all. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was as if the forest had turned against me, the trees closing in, the shadows growing darker. I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, but they kept creeping back in, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts like some insidious force. The next morning came without incident. The sun rose, the birds started to sing, and the forest once again felt peaceful. I convinced myself that I had been imagining things the night before, that it was just the isolation, the cold, and the unfamiliarity of being deep in the woods alone. I broke camp, packed up, and began my hike back down the trail, feeling a sense of relief as I left the clearing behind. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. The trail back was the same as the one I had hiked the day before, but somehow it felt different now. Every turn, every rustle in the bushes made me pause, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. I was being paranoid, I knew that, but the feeling wouldn't leave. It was like being hunted, even though I didn't know by what. As I neared the end of the trail, I spotted something strange ahead. Something was off about the path. It was littered with branches, broken twigs, and leaves in a way that didn't make sense. The trail was supposed to be well maintained. There were no fallen trees, no debris, but here it looked like someone or something had been through. I stopped, my heart racing. I should have turned back right then, I should have. But instead, I continued forward, drawn by some strange impulse. The trail seemed to narrow, the trees growing thicker again as if the forest was reclaiming the path. That's when I saw it. A large rock in the middle of the trail, blocking my way. I walked up to it, kicking it aside, and as I did, something glinted in the dirt. A small object, half buried under the leaves. I crouched down to get a better look. It was a knife. Not just any knife, but a hunting knife, well worn, the handle chipped and scratched as if it had been used countless times. My stomach twisted into knots. What the hell was a knife doing here, in the middle of the trail? I didn't want to touch it. My gut told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached out, grabbing the knife by the handle, and as I did, something scraped against the back of my neck. I spun around, the knife raised instinctively, but there was nothing there, only the dense forest and the growing silence. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for something, anything, to move, but nothing did. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating, until I could hardly breathe. Then I heard it again, the rustling, closer now, like someone or something was moving just off the trail. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I didn't care about the direction. I just needed to get out. The forest seemed to close in behind me, the trees rushing past, their branches reaching out like claws trying to grab me. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my legs aching, but I didn't stop. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I broke through the trees and into the clearing where I had camped the night before. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands shaking as I glanced around. There was no one there, no one following me. I finally stopped, my heart still racing, trying to calm myself down. There were no signs of anyone.
No sounds.
The forest was still again. I didn't stay much longer. I packed up my stuff quickly, barely taking the time to organize anything properly. I didn't want to be out there any longer. The unease had turned into something much worse. A deep, gnawing fear I couldn't shake. I walked back to the car, my nerves on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me at any moment. When I reached the car, I locked the doors as soon as I got inside. I sat there for a few minutes, the engine running, trying to steady my breath. What had happened out there? What was that shadow I had seen? Who had left the knife in the trail? I'll never know. I'll never go back to those woods again. Some things are better left unexplored. The silence of the forest is always louder than you think. And sometimes the forest doesn't want you there at all. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wilderness, disconnected from everything, that clears my head. No cell service, no internet, just nature. It's peaceful. So, when I decided to go camping alone in the backwoods near the small town I grew up in, I didn't think twice. I'd done it before many times. I arrived at the trailhead early in the afternoon. The sun high, but not too hot. The air had that crisp, earthy scent you only get in the woods. Pine, dirt, and something else that I couldn't quite place. The kind of smell that always makes me feel both calm and alive at the same time. The campsite I planned to reach was about 5 miles up the trail, a secluded spot by a small stream. It was a place I'd been to as a kid with my family, but I hadn't visited in years. I figured it was the perfect place for a few days of solitude. I packed my gear: tent, sleeping bag, stove, some food, and a few other essentials. Nothing too fancy, a simple setup for a simple trip. The first couple of miles were easy, just a well-maintained path. The sun dappled through the trees, casting shadows on the ground. Birds chirped in the distance, and every now and then, I'd hear the rustle of leaves or a squirrel darting up a tree. The sounds of nature were like a soothing soundtrack to my thoughts. I kept my pace steady, enjoying the quiet and the peaceful rhythm of walking. But as I got deeper into the woods, the trail started to narrow. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out much of the light. The air felt cooler, and the occasional gust of wind made the trees sway and creak. There was no one else around. It felt like I was the only one on this stretch of earth. The peace was nice, but it felt strange too. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The deeper I went into the woods, the more I started to question my decision to come alone. It was a normal trail, and I knew I was heading to a familiar campsite, but the isolation started to feel heavier. The quiet, almost oppressive. It wasn't that I was scared, exactly. It was more a sense of discomfort that I couldn't quite explain. I pushed those thoughts aside. This was just how the woods were. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. The woods have a way of making you feel small, like you're just another creature passing through. I had to remind myself that this was exactly what I came for: peace and solitude. After a couple more miles, I reached a small clearing. There, just beyond it, was the stream I remembered, trickling down through the rocks. The sound of the water flowing over stones was soothing, and I knew my campsite was close. I set up my tent near the stream, unpacked my gear, and decided to take a few minutes to relax. The day was starting to wane, the sun dipping lower in the sky. I could feel the temperature dropping, the cool evening air creeping in. I sat on a rock by the stream, watching the water swirl around the rocks, lost in the sound of it. My mind wandered as I waited for dusk to settle in fully. Everything felt right, but that nagging feeling of unease still lingered. It was like there was something I hadn't accounted for, something that didn't belong in the woods, something out of place. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. As the sun set behind the trees, I got a fire going. I set up my stove and cooked a simple dinner, just some dehydrated pasta with sauce and a cup of tea. The warmth from the fire felt good against the evening chill, and the scent of burning wood was comforting. It was around 8 p.m. when I finally finished eating. The sky had fully darkened, the stars just beginning to twinkle through the gaps in the canopy above. I felt a small sense of satisfaction. I was truly alone here. No one else was around. This was my time. But again, that gnawing discomfort tugged at me, a sense that I was being watched, or maybe something was waiting just beyond the trees. It wasn't like I had heard anything. No footsteps, no sounds of animals moving nearby, but there was a palpable stillness in the air, like everything was holding its breath. Even the fire crackled quietly, like it didn't want to disturb the silence. I tried to shake it off. I finished my tea and decided to turn in for the night. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay back on my sleeping bag. My head hit the pillow, and I closed my eyes, hoping for sleep to come quickly. The sound of the stream outside was lulling me to sleep. But then, as I was on the edge of drifting off, I heard it. A twig snapped. I froze, eyes wide open in the dark. The sound was soft, distant, but clear. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The wind had died down, so it couldn't have been that. Maybe an animal? A deer or a raccoon? I strained my ears, listening for more sounds. The only noise I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. But that one snap of the twig echoed in my mind. My mind raced as I lay there in the dark. What was that? It wasn't like the usual animal sounds I'd heard before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My breath quickened, and I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew that feeling, that gut instinct, was something I shouldn't ignore. I lay there, waiting. The hours passed slowly. Every little sound made me tense up. Every slight shift in the wind had me second-guessing the safety of my camp. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. But then, around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. A rustling sound, like something moving through the brush near the edge of the campsite. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and flicked it on. My hands were shaking, my mind scrambling to figure out what was out there. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the trees in front of me, but I saw nothing. I stayed still for a long time, holding the flashlight in a tight grip, my breathing shallow. The silence returned, deep and unbroken, except for the quiet hum of the stream. Was it just an animal? A curious raccoon? I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if it wasn't an animal at all. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wilderness, with nothing but the sounds of the trees and the crackle of a campfire, that made everything else feel far away. This time, I went by myself. I thought it would be a good opportunity for some quiet time, to disconnect from everything and just enjoy the peace. The place I chose was a small, less-known spot by a creek in a dense forest. It wasn't marked on most maps, but I had a good sense of direction and figured it would be perfect for a solo trip. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky. The air had that crisp, earthy scent, fresh, but not too cold. I parked my car, grabbed my gear, and set off down a narrow trail that led into the woods. The first few steps were peaceful. The only sounds were my boots crunching against the dry leaves, and the distant sound of the creek bubbling away. There was something calming about being the only one around for miles. The trail was more rugged than I expected, and as I walked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me. Their gnarled roots twisted out of the soil, almost like they were trying to reach out and grab me. But I didn't mind. I liked the solitude. After about an hour, I found a nice spot near the creek to set up camp. The water's soft murmurs made it an ideal place to sit and relax, away from the world. I pitched my tent, unpacked my gear, and started a fire. The sun was setting, and the air was turning cooler. I sat down by the fire with a can of beans, just watching the flickering light dance across the trees. The first night was uneventful. I stayed up for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and the soft burble of the creek. Eventually, the fire dwindled down, and I crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the crackling wood as I drifted off to sleep. But something woke me in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure what it was at first. I heard a sound, not like the usual rustling of animals in the woods. This sound was deliberate, almost as if something was moving through the forest with purpose. It was hard to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, but I could tell it was close, very close. I lay still, listening. My heart rate picked up. It was too quiet for animals. There was no scurrying, no small twigs snapping underfoot. This was different. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees. First, I saw nothing. The beam lingered on a few bushes and the dark shadows of the trees, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, just on the edge of the light, I saw movement. It was too fast, too sudden for an animal. Something large and dark darted between the trees, too quickly for me to make out what it was. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It was probably just a deer, I told myself, or maybe a bear. But no, bears don't move like that. It was too quick and too deliberate. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my heart pounding, every little noise making me jump. The next morning, I packed up my things and moved a little further into the woods. I wasn't sure what had been out there, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. The second day was uneventful. I hiked for miles, exploring the forest. The farther I went, the less sure I became of my surroundings. It was hard to keep track of time in the thick woods. Everything felt the same, the trees, the creek, the rocks, all blending together. But I kept going. It felt good to be moving, to be away from the camp, away from that feeling. I found a small clearing and sat down to rest. I ate some jerky and drank water from my bottle. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches high above me. Everything felt a little more tense, like the air was charged with something. I shook it off, told myself I was just tired. As I was about to head back, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt, large, human-like prints, but they were deep, as if someone or something heavy had walked through the area recently. The prints were fresh, almost too fresh. I took a few steps closer, inspecting them. There was something off about them. They didn't look quite right. They were too wide, the toes too pronounced. And there was no sign of a human in the area. No gear, no bag, no nothing. Just these strange, deep prints. I felt my stomach churn. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned to leave but couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder and saw nothing. Nothing but trees. Still, that feeling of being watched stayed with me all the way back to camp. That night, I built my fire higher than usual. The sky was clear, but the wind had picked up again, and the forest felt even more unsettling. The sounds of the night seemed closer, sharper, more intense. I heard a branch snap in the distance. It wasn't an animal. It was too loud for that. Someone or something was moving through the forest. I kept my flashlight close, scanning the tree line, waiting for any sign of movement. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something just beyond the reach of the light, a dark shape moving between the trees. But when I shined the beam in that direction, nothing was there. The forest felt too still, too quiet, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching. I stayed up late again, watching the fire. It had to be just my imagination, I told myself. There was no one out here, no one but me. But when I finally crawled into my tent, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. I lay there in the dark, wide awake, listening to the forest around me. Every little rustle, every crack of a twig made my heart race. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the unmistakable sound of someone walking outside my tent. It was slow, heavy, methodical. It stopped just outside the tent. I held my breath, frozen in place. The sounds of the steps grew louder, closer. Then suddenly, there was a sharp snap, like a twig breaking underfoot, and the footsteps stopped altogether. I waited for what felt like hours. Every muscle in my body was tight, my eyes glued to the small opening in the tent. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have anything to defend myself. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the sounds faded. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the crunch of soil beneath heavy steps, but nothing else. After a long while, I finally mustered the courage to unzip the tent. The outside was silent. I shone my flashlight in every direction, but there was no sign of anyone. No tracks, no movement, just the dark, empty forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I was exhausted, but I packed up my gear and decided to head back to the car. There was no reason to stay. Whatever or whoever was out there was not something I wanted to deal with. I followed the trail back, the familiar surroundings providing little comfort. The forest felt wrong. I made it back to my car in one piece, but as I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. For the first time in my life, I was sure that I hadn't been alone out there. I haven't been camping alone since. I've gone back to the woods, but only with friends, and even then, I'm always looking over my shoulder, just in case. I was never really one for camping, but something about the idea of a weekend trip into the woods appealed to me that year. I had a group of friends who were all seasoned campers, and when they invited me, I figured it'd be a good opportunity to challenge myself and experience something new. After all, there was no harm in a few nights away from the city, right? The plan was simple. Drive up to a remote area a few hours out of town, set up camp, and enjoy the beauty of nature. The usual stuff. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. It was supposed to be just a peaceful weekend, with nothing more than a quiet retreat into nature. We left early in the morning, a small convoy of 2 cars packed with tents, sleeping bags, and food. As we pulled away from the city, the streets grew quieter and the buildings thinned out. The roads turned from concrete to gravel, and the trees started to crowd in on both sides. Eventually, our cell service dropped out, which only added to the sense of isolation. The deeper we got into the woods, the more remote everything felt. We arrived in the early afternoon and immediately set to work on our campsite. There was something about the scent of pine and earth that felt refreshing. The forest seemed peaceful at first, almost welcoming. We picked a nice spot near a creek where we could hear the water babbling over rocks. The sun was shining, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. That night, we sat around the campfire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the distant rush of water, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was beautiful, serene even, but there was something off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As the evening wore on, the temperature dropped quickly. One of the guys, Jason, suggested we all go to bed, so we did. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and tried to settle in for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness I couldn't shake. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. A loud, sharp crack of a twig snapping, coming from somewhere just beyond the tree line. My heart began to race. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, too heavy. I lay there, staring at the fabric of my tent, straining to hear anything else. The forest was so quiet that even the smallest sound felt amplified. I could hear my own breath, the beating of my heart. And then it came again, another snap of a twig, followed by something, a faint dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the underbrush. I froze, my mind racing. It had to be an animal, right? But why was it so close? My fingers were curled tightly around the zipper of the tent, my mind battling between the urge to peek outside and the overwhelming fear of what I might see. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. It sounded almost like footsteps now, heavy, slow, deliberate. I didn't dare look outside. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, the sound stopped. Everything fell silent again. The wind had died down. The forest seemed to hold its breath. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was out there watching. Morning came slowly. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long, cool shadows on the forest floor. The sounds of the night had disappeared, but the unease lingered. When I finally got the courage to crawl out of my tent, I found the others already awake. They seemed fine, completely oblivious to the strange noises I'd heard. They were just getting ready to make breakfast. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd heard the night before. I didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, I just went along with the plan, trying to push the unease out of my mind. But the feeling never quite left. As the day went on, the woods seemed to get darker, the shadows growing longer. We went for a hike, trying to make the most of the beautiful weather, but even the trees seemed to crowd in on us. The path was narrow and winding, and the deeper we went, the more the forest closed in around us. We eventually found ourselves near the edge of a steep ravine. The view was breathtaking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the trees. I caught myself looking over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the woods, but there was nothing there, just trees, rocks, and the occasional bird. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We were all back at camp, gathered around the fire again. The firelight flickered against the darkening sky, and the woods around us seemed to grow colder, more oppressive. That's when I heard it again, the dragging sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the trees behind our campsite. This time, I wasn't imagining it. The others heard it too. Jason, who was closest to the woods, stood up and peered into the darkness, his face tense. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. We all nodded. The sound was unmistakable, a slow, deliberate dragging sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the forest floor. Jason grabbed a flashlight and headed into the woods, his boots crunching on the dry leaves as he moved. We all sat there in the growing darkness, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. The fire crackled, but it felt small and weak compared to the overwhelming quiet of the forest. Jason was gone for what felt like an eternity. Just as I was about to suggest we go after him, he emerged from the trees, his face pale. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, staring at the ground. Then he shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "There's nothing out there," he said. "I couldn't find anything. No tracks, no sign of anything. It's like whatever it was just disappeared." But I knew something was wrong. We didn't sleep much that night. The sounds came and went, just enough to keep us on edge. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear them. Those dragging, heavy footsteps in the woods, coming closer and closer. And when the morning finally came, I was more than ready to leave. We packed up our things as quickly as we could. But as we loaded the cars, something caught my eye. In the dirt near the edge of our campsite, there were tracks. Deep, uneven prints that hadn't been there the day before. They looked like human footprints, but something about them was off. They were too wide, too heavy, and they seemed to drag in places like someone or something had been stumbling through the dirt. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. We left immediately. As we drove away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. The woods were vast, and I was certain that something had been out there with us. Something I couldn't explain. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew the truth. We never went back. I've always loved camping, or at least I used to. The idea of being out in nature, disconnected from everything, surrounded by the quiet of the forest, always gave me a sense of peace. But that all changed the last time I went camping. It's hard to explain, but something about that night, something in the air, in the way the forest felt, still haunts me. And now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm never really alone when I go into the woods. It was midsummer, and I'd packed everything for a solo camping trip in a secluded spot near the edge of a national forest. It wasn't far from home, just a few hours' drive, but it felt like the kind of place where you could disappear for a while. Perfect retreat from everything. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, mainly because I wanted to avoid the usual questions. Are you sure? You're going alone? I'd been camping solo before, and I was confident in my skills. I knew how to set up camp, start a fire, cook a meal on a camp stove. I had a small tent, a reliable sleeping bag, and my favorite old hatchet I'd had for years. The woods, in my mind, were a safe place. The trail I took wasn't marked well, and there were barely any signs of other people as I hiked in. I liked that. I was used to being out in remote places, but as I walked further away from the main trail, something felt different. The trees seemed thicker, the shadows darker, as if the forest itself was quietly watching. I shrugged it off, though. It was just my imagination. I was tired and eager to get to my campsite. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was starting to dip behind the treeline, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I had to set up quickly. The place I picked had a small creek running nearby, and the sound of water was soothing. I knew I wouldn't be able to make a fire for long once it got dark, so I hurried to get my tent up and my stove ready. It was a routine I'd done 100 times. But tonight, I felt an edge of unease that I couldn't quite pinpoint. The woods around me were quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I hadn't seen any wildlife, not even a bird, which was odd for this area. But again, I told myself it was probably just the time of day. Maybe they were all hiding as the temperature dropped. I made myself a simple meal, boiled some water for tea, and settled in for the evening. As night fell, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to relax. I knew I wouldn't sleep well at first, but that was normal. I pulled my sleeping bag around me and lay there listening to the quiet. The soft gurgle of the creek was the only sound. It wasn't long before the silence started to feel oppressive. I felt my mind wandering to strange places, imagining things in the dark. There was something about the air, the way it felt so still. The trees stood so tall and thick around me, their shadows stretching over the campsite. The darkness seemed to press in. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. It was just the isolation. I'd be fine. But then, just as I was about to nod off, I heard something. A noise, a soft rustling, too close to be just the wind, but too distant to be a person. I stiffened, straining my ears. It was hard to pinpoint, but it sounded like something was moving around my campsite. I knew it could be an animal, a deer, maybe, or something small like a raccoon. Still, it didn't sit right with me. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on and shining it through the small mesh window of the tent. Nothing, just the darkness outside. The rustling stopped too. I exhaled, a little embarrassed by myself. I was letting my imagination run wild. I tried to settle back into my sleeping bag, but I couldn't. I kept thinking I heard something moving in the brush just outside. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. But eventually, the sounds stopped altogether. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural. That's when I heard it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps. Not an animal, not the wind, human footsteps. My heart started to race. I couldn't tell where they were coming from. I strained to hear, but it was hard to focus over the pounding of my pulse in my ears. The steps were slow, deliberate. Someone was walking around my camp. I forced myself to stay still, to not make a sound. My mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be another camper? Maybe someone lost? Or someone just passing through? I hadn't heard any vehicles, though. It was too quiet. And whoever it was, they were walking too quietly, like they were trying to avoid making noise, like they were trying to stay hidden. I waited, holding my breath. The footsteps circled around my tent, slow, deliberate. They stopped just on the other side, right next to where I lay. For a moment, everything went utterly still. Then I heard a rustling, something brushing against the tent. My heart nearly stopped. Couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to get up, to do something, but I was frozen. The rustling continued, followed by the faintest sound of a voice. A low murmur, so soft I could barely hear it. No words, just a faint hum of sound. I couldn't make sense of it. The voice was like a whisper in the wind, but there was no wind. I lay there, not daring to move, for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. No more footsteps, no more whispering. I don't know how long I waited, listening to the silence. It felt like hours. Eventually, I forced myself to unzip the tent slowly, just enough to peek outside. There was no one, nothing but the trees and the dark. I didn't know what to think. Was I just imagining things? Had I fallen asleep and dreamed it all? I wasn't sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't want to stay in that tent any longer. Something about it felt unsafe, so I gathered my things as quickly as I could. I packed up everything, my stove, my food, my gear, and made sure I didn't leave anything behind. As I stood there in the clearing with my backpack on, I realized something else. The quiet was gone. In the distance, I could hear what sounded like someone moving through the trees. It wasn't the rustling of leaves from a deer or any animal I knew. It was the sound of human footsteps again. Slow, deliberate. My stomach turned. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was out there. I didn't hesitate any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and started to move, not in a rush, but not slow either. I followed the trail, trying to stay calm, but the feeling that I was being watched never left me. The footsteps seemed to follow me at a distance, always there, but never quite close enough for me to see, just out of reach. I don't know how long I walked, but the footsteps never stopped. They were always behind me in the woods just off the trail. When I reached the main trail, I didn't stop to rest. I just kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't until I reached the parking area, with the safety of the car in sight, that I dared to look over my shoulder one last time. There was no one there, not a soul, but that feeling of being followed didn't leave me. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the wheel, my mind replaying every step, every rustle, every whisper. The woods, I realized, don't forget, and neither do I. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, the tent, the forest, and a little solitude. I had been craving a break from everything. The noise, the traffic, the constant stream of notifications. A weekend to reconnect with nature, to listen to the wind through the trees, to let the quiet ground me.
No distractions.
Just me and the wilderness. I parked my car at the trailhead around noon on Friday. The sun was high, and the air had that crisp, fresh scent that only nature can offer. I had spent the last few weeks planning this, researching the area, reading up on the best trails, the most peaceful spots. I'd even packed a few extra supplies, just in case. I wasn't exactly an experienced camper, but I had all the basics. A 2-person tent, sleeping bag, a portable stove, food for a few days, and water. I felt prepared, confident. I set off down the trail with my backpack slung over my shoulder. The path was well marked, nothing too difficult. As I walked, the forest around me felt alive. The rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. It was peaceful, but not eerily so. The forest had that comfortable, familiar quality to it, like being at home. After about an hour of hiking, I found a small clearing near a stream, with just enough space for my tent. I set up camp, my movements quick and practiced, though I could feel the weight of isolation settling in. It wasn't a bad feeling, just different. The quiet here was heavier than I expected. Out of place, almost, but I brushed it off. I lit my camp stove, cooked some pasta, and settled down on the ground to eat. I had a good book with me, but as the day turned into evening, I found myself just sitting in the silence, listening. The sun dipped below the treetops, and the shadows around me lengthened. The forest began to take on a different mood. The air grew cooler, and the chirping of the birds turned into the occasional croak of a distant frog. By the time it was dark, I was ready to turn in. The stars above were stunning, the sky clear. I zipped myself into the tent, making sure everything was secured. The gentle rush of the stream nearby helped lull me into a sense of calm. But that night, I didn't sleep well. It started as a distant sound, a crack, like something breaking underfoot. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer stepping on a branch. But then I heard it again, closer this time, the unmistakable snap of something large moving through the underbrush. My heart rate picked up, but I didn't move. It was probably a bear or some other wild animal. I told myself, they were out there, sure. I was aware of that, but they usually kept their distance, right? The noise came again, a slow, deliberate crunching. It wasn't an animal rummaging through the forest like I expected. It was different, too deliberate, too slow. I held my breath, straining my ears. Nothing. The silence returned, but my pulse was racing. I forced myself to relax, to settle down. It was just the forest. It had to be, but sleep didn't come. I lay there, wide-eyed, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind whispered through the trees, and the stream babbled softly. But every now and then, I heard that crunch, that deliberate movement, closer this time. I wanted to call out, but the words got stuck in my throat. What if it was someone else out here in the woods? But no one should be out here. It was late, and I was miles from the nearest campsite or trail. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable rustling of leaves. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't a bird or a deer. I needed to check. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight beside me and flicked it on. My heart was pounding, and my hands shook slightly. I unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The clearing was empty, just the trees, the shadows, and the rushing water of the stream. But I didn't feel any better. I felt watched. I couldn't explain it, but there was something off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I lay back down, trying to calm myself. It was just my imagination. The wilderness had a way of playing tricks on the mind. I closed my eyes, but the feeling didn't go away. The sounds didn't stop. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of something heavy brushing against the side of the tent. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. The fabric of the tent shifted slightly, as though something or someone was pressing against it from the outside. The silence stretched, and I held my breath. I didn't know what to do. If it was someone, why were they out here? And if it wasn't, then what? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I wanted to get up, to do something, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, my limbs unwilling to move. The only thing I could do was listen, and I listened intently, waiting for the next sound, the next clue to what was happening. Nothing, just the soft, steady sound of the stream. But that pressure against the side of the tent, I could still feel it. It lingered, as if waiting for me to make a move. I had to get out of there. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I didn't care. I wasn't sticking around to find out. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, trying to be as quiet as possible. I grabbed my flashlight, holding it tightly in my hand. The night was even darker now. The moon had disappeared behind a thick layer of clouds, leaving the world in complete blackness. The air was colder than before, and my breath came out in sharp, visible puffs. I stepped outside, my boots crunching softly on the forest floor. I stood still, listening. Nothing. No movement. The only sound was the rushing of the stream. I glanced around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing. No person. No animal. I slowly made my way back toward the trail, my eyes scanning the forest around me. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart skip a beat. But there was no sign of anything, anyone. The wilderness was just that. Silent, vast, and indifferent. I made it back to my car without incident, though my hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. I threw my bag in the back seat and got inside, slamming the door shut. I didn't look back. I drove for miles, not knowing where I was going, just wanting to get as far away from that place as possible. My mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. But I couldn't. There was no logical explanation. I hadn't seen anything. I hadn't heard anything, not really. And yet, I knew what I had felt. I wasn't crazy. Something had been there, watching. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I found a small motel a few hours away, where I checked in, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I didn't sleep much. Couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. By morning, I was ready to put the whole thing behind me, but something still gnawed at the back of my mind. I had gone back to that forest, expecting peace. What I found there was something else entirely. I didn't know if it was a person, an animal, or just the isolation playing tricks on me. But the truth was, I didn't care. I wasn't going back to find out. I spent the next few days on the road, trying to clear my head, trying to forget the feeling of being watched, the fear that had crept into my bones. I never spoke about it to anyone. It felt too strange, too unbelievable. But it had happened. It was real. And I knew one thing for sure. I would never camp alone again. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. Just me and my backpack, a tent, and the wilderness. I'd chosen a remote site up in the mountains, far away from the usual crowded campsites that people frequented. I had been camping before, a few times with friends, but this time I was alone. There was something peaceful about the idea of solitude. No one around to talk to, just the rustling of trees and the sounds of nature. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just some hiking, a little time by the campfire, and the quiet that only nature could provide. I arrived at the trailhead just before noon. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, not a cloud in sight, and a light breeze. The parking lot was almost empty, with only a couple of cars scattered around. It felt like the kind of place where no one bothered to go, and that's exactly what I wanted. After parking, I shouldered my pack and began the hike. The trail started off easily enough, well-marked and well-worn, but the deeper I went into the forest, the more isolated it felt. The trees grew taller, denser. The trail narrowed, the earth becoming more uneven, rocks and roots making it harder to navigate. I didn't mind. I was used to hiking on more challenging terrain. The only thing that felt off was how eerily quiet it was. Not even birds were singing, and the only sounds were the crunch of dirt and leaves under my boots. By mid-afternoon, I reached the site I had scouted on a map, a small clearing next to a creek, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. Perfect. I unloaded my gear, set up my tent, and gathered some dry wood for the fire. As the sun dipped lower, I began to feel the weight of the isolation. The wind had picked up a little, rustling the leaves, but the air had grown cooler. I hadn't seen a single person since I started the hike, and the feeling of being completely alone in the wilderness began to settle in my chest. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet where you could almost hear your own heartbeat. By the time I had the fire going, it was dusk. The flames flickered brightly, casting long shadows across the clearing. I sat down on a log, pulling my knees up to my chest, the warmth of the fire a comforting contrast to the cold creeping in. I pulled out a granola bar and ate slowly, looking around at the darkening forest. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and I listened to the crackling of the fire, trying to push away the creeping unease that had started to stir. I thought about how silly it was. It was just a quiet night in the woods, nothing to fear, but the feeling that something was wrong refused to leave. I stood up and walked to the edge of the clearing to gather more firewood. As I bent down to pick up a branch, I heard something, a snap, like a twig breaking. I froze. For a moment, I just stood there, listening. My heart started to race. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the wind rustling the leaves. But then I heard it again, another snap. This time it was closer. My thoughts raced. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or something. But then I thought about how still the air was earlier, how there hadn't been any sounds at all except the breeze. And now, suddenly, there was something or someone in the woods. I straightened up, trying to look through the trees, but the darkness was thick. I couldn't see anything, not even the creek that should have been just beyond the trees. The snap of the twig came again, this time followed by a soft rustling sound, like something moving in the underbrush. I couldn't see anything, but I was certain that there was something out there. For a long time, I just stood still, waiting for the sound to stop. Didn't. My mind started to race, running through all the possibilities. I wasn't supposed to be near any other campsites, and no one else had parked at the trailhead. So who? I shook my head. No, this was my imagination playing tricks on me. There was nothing out there. I had to be overthinking it. Just some animal. Nothing more. But just as I was about to turn back to the fire, I heard the sound again. Only this time it was closer, much closer. My instincts screamed at me to move. I darted back to the camp, heart pounding in my chest. My hands fumbled as I grabbed a large branch from the firewood pile, using it as a makeshift weapon. The firelight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows, and the crackling seemed too loud, too jarring. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I spent the next few hours huddled by the fire, my eyes darting nervously toward the tree-line. The sounds didn't stop. The occasional snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the faint sound of something heavy brushing against the ground. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, I couldn't see anything. There was no shape, no figure moving in the darkness. Just the sounds, just the sense that I wasn't alone. It was around midnight when I finally decided I couldn't stay there anymore. My nerves were shot, my hands trembling. I packed up what little I had left out, and despite the irrational fear gnawing at me, I grabbed my things and decided to head back down the trail. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But I wasn't willing to take the risk of staying out there any longer. I had no idea who or what might be watching, and the idea of spending another night with that suffocating feeling was too much to bear. The hike down was slow. The trail was more difficult to navigate in the dark, especially with the firelight behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It wasn't just the sounds anymore. It was the sensation. The hair on the back of my neck standing up, the feeling of eyes on my back, the almost oppressive weight of the silence around me. The only thing I could hear was my breathing and the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. I stumbled a few times, but eventually, the faint glow of the parking lot lights came into view. Relief flooded over me, but the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. I reached the car and slammed the door behind me, locking it immediately. For a long time, I just sat there, staring out at the dark woods through the windshield. I wanted to believe it was just a figment of my imagination. I wanted to tell myself that I had just been spooked by the isolation. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, that something had been out there watching me. I didn't know who or what it was, but the thought gnawed at me. I had been in the woods many times before, and never once had I felt so vulnerable. Took me hours to get home that night. The drive felt endless, and even when I finally made it back, the sense of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there hadn't been a random encounter. It was as if I'd been deliberately watched, waited for. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a hiker. It was something else. Over the next few weeks, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a coincidence. But the sense of dread never fully went away. I couldn't forget the sounds in the woods, the sensation of being hunted, even if I wasn't sure by what. I told myself I'd never go camping alone again, but there was one thing that haunted me more than anything else: that feeling of being watched. I never went back to that part of the mountains. Some places are meant to be left alone, and sometimes the things that happen in the woods are better left unexplained. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I'll never forget the sense that I wasn't the only one in that clearing. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment late at night, I'll hear a branch snap in the distance, the wind rustling the trees, and I'll wonder briefly if the woods ever really let me go. It was meant to be an ordinary camping trip, just a weekend getaway in the woods, away from the chaos of everyday life. At least that's what I kept telling myself as I loaded up the car with camping gear that morning. I had been looking forward to it all week. Nature, fresh air, a chance to disconnect. My plan was simple: find a spot by the lake, set up camp, and spend the next couple of days relaxing, fishing, and reading. Nothing special, just peace. I arrived at the campsite around midday, after a few hours of driving down winding country roads, far from any major towns. The road had been narrow and bumpy, with the trees pressing in on either side like they were closing me in. It had rained the night before, and the ground was still wet, the air thick with moisture. The smell of pine and damp earth hung heavily in the air. I parked my car, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, looking out at the sprawling forest around me. The trees seemed endless, stretching out in every direction. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet where the silence itself feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. I shrugged it off, convinced I was just overthinking things. After all, I had been to remote places before. I unloaded my gear and started setting up the tent, feeling the soft drizzle of rain on the back of my neck. The breeze carried the sound of rustling leaves and the distant calls of birds, but there was something off about it, like the woods were somehow waiting. I didn't think much of it at first, though. It was probably just the weather, the kind of day where the woods felt extra alive, you know? Took me a little longer than usual to get everything set up. I wasn't in any rush, though. I wanted to take my time, make sure everything was perfect. The tent was pitched near the edge of a small, overgrown path that led to the lake. The trees around me were tall, towering above, their branches hanging low and thick with leaves. A creek ran somewhere behind the trees, though I couldn't see it from where I stood. Once the tent was up and my things organized, I made my way toward the lake. The water was calm, still. The mist from the rain hung low, making everything look distant and faint, like it was all a dream. I thought about fishing for a bit, but didn't feel like bothering. Instead, I just sat there on the muddy bank, my feet dangling over the edge. The quiet was starting to get to me again. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a small fire near my tent. The glow of the flames flickered and danced, casting shadows on the trees around me. I had packed some food for dinner, canned beans and some instant noodles. Nothing fancy. As I ate, I watched the fire, lost in thought. There was something oddly comforting about being out here, disconnected from everything. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I kept hearing things, branches cracking, footsteps in the distance. But every time I looked around, nothing was there. It was just the wind, I told myself. It had to be. I turned in early, not feeling particularly tired, but deciding to get some rest anyway. The inside of the tent was small and cramped, and the air smelled musty, even though it was relatively dry. I laid on my back, staring up at the top of the tent, listening to the rustle of leaves and the occasional animals scurrying through the underbrush. After a while, I fell into an uneasy sleep, the sound of the forest surrounding me. I woke up to a sound in the middle of the night. It was faint, but it was enough to snap me awake. I lay still, listening. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the dry leaves outside my tent. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was out there. I sat up, my mind racing. It was late past midnight. Who would be out here this time of night? There were no other campsites around, no trails, just miles of dense woods. I reached for my flashlight and shined it toward the entrance of the tent. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing out there. No sign of movement, no one in sight. I felt a cold sweat creeping down my back as I listened. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was oppressive now, suffocating. My instincts told me to stay still, not to make a sound. Maybe it was a wild animal. Maybe it was just the wind again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. I must have fallen back asleep at some point, though I don't remember when. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was already high in the sky. The air felt different, heavier somehow, as though something had changed overnight. I stretched out of the tent, trying to shake off the lingering unease. The world outside looked peaceful again, bathed in golden sunlight. I thought maybe I had imagined the sounds from the night before, or maybe they had just been the normal noises of the forest. I made coffee over the fire, took a deep breath of the fresh morning air, and tried to enjoy the stillness. I should have been more aware. I should have packed up and left that morning, but I didn't. The woods were too inviting. The day passed slowly. I spent most of it by the lake, walking along its edge, throwing rocks into the water. I felt a strange sense of relief when the sun began to set. There was something about the night that unsettled me. That evening, as I sat by the fire, the same feeling returned, the sensation of being watched. But this time, it was more intense, as if someone or something was standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt the weight of eyes on my back. I heard the footsteps again, louder this time, closer. My heart raced. I stood up, gripping the flashlight tightly. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Just the wind, the leaves, the soft rustling of the branches. But the feeling of being watched was growing stronger, like something was closing in around me. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. I didn't know what it was, but I had a sudden, overwhelming sense that I was no longer alone. Something was out there, just waiting for me to make a move. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, my mind on high alert, listening to every sound that came from the forest. At some point, I heard what sounded like whispering. It was so faint, so soft, that I thought maybe I was imagining it. But then it came again, clearer this time, low voices like a conversation just out of reach. I gripped my flashlight harder, pointing it toward the sound, but there was nothing there, nothing at all. I didn't know what to do. I could leave, but that would mean driving in the dark, miles away from civilization. I could stay, but I didn't know how much longer I could handle the feeling of being hunted, of knowing that someone was out there, just beyond the trees. I made the decision to pack up and leave the next morning. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I was too anxious to eat. The forest felt oppressive now, like the trees themselves were watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I packed my gear quickly, tossing everything into the car as fast as I could. As I started the engine and pulled away, I glanced back at the campsite. The mist from the lake was rolling in, thick and dense, swallowing up the ground. The trees seemed to loom taller, their twisted shapes barely visible in the fog. It was then that I saw it, a figure standing motionless at the edge of the woods, just standing there watching. It was too far away to make out details, but I knew it was there. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. It just stood there in the mist, silent. I drove away as fast as I could, my hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back again. As I drove down the winding road, away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. When I finally made it back to the main road, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the tension in my chest lift slightly. It was over. I was safe. The forest, with its dark, hidden secrets, was behind me. But the memory of that figure, standing alone in the mist, would haunt me for a long time to come. Some nights, when I'm lying in bed, I'll hear a rustling outside my window. I know it's just the wind, but my mind can't help but remember. The woods are full of things we don't understand, things we can't see or hear until it's too late. And maybe, just maybe, there are some things better left undiscovered. I've always loved camping. There's something about the quiet of the forest, the fresh air, and the peace that comes with being far away from everything. It's just me, the fire, and the woods. No phones, no distractions, just the rhythm of nature. At least that's how it's supposed to be. It was a Friday evening when I decided to head out. I'd been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. I picked a spot I'd never been to before, deep in the woods, away from the usual trails. It wasn't marked on any popular maps, but I'd found it on a more obscure site, the kind of place where you can truly escape. At least that's what I thought. The drive was smooth, the weather perfect, cloudless skies, no humidity. I made it to the trailhead by late afternoon and started the hike in. I'd packed light: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, food, and a knife. You don't really need much when you're camping alone. I was looking forward to some quiet reflection, a little solitude to clear my head. The hike wasn't bad at all. The path was easy to follow, winding through a mix of tall pines and thick underbrush. I stopped once or twice to take a few pictures, but mostly, I just enjoyed the peace. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional bird call overhead. As the sun began to set, I reached the clearing I had been aiming for. It was a small meadow surrounded by trees on three sides. A little stream ran through the far corner, the sound of the water adding to the tranquility. I couldn't help but smile. This was it, the perfect spot. I set up my tent quickly, securing it with a few stakes, and built a small fire pit using some rocks I found nearby. The fire was a comfort, flickering and crackling as the air cooled. By the time I had my stove going and was cooking some dinner, it was nearly dark. The light from the fire made long, dancing shadows on the trees, adding to the sense of isolation. After eating, I cleaned up and sat back by the fire, letting the warmth seep into my skin. The forest felt so alive around me, but it was a kind of quiet life. The sounds were distant, the wind moving through the trees, the occasional splash of something small in the stream. I was alone, but I didn't feel lonely. It was a peaceful, almost meditative kind of solitude. It wasn't until the sun had fully dipped behind the horizon that things started to feel off. I noticed it first in the way the wind sounded. The trees were no longer just swaying in the breeze. It was as if something was moving through them, pushing against the branches, rustling in a strange, irregular pattern. My eyes darted toward the tree line, but I saw nothing, just the dark shapes of the trees against the night sky. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The forest was full of creatures, and they were usually active at night. It wasn't anything to worry about, but then I heard something else, a soft crackling sound. It wasn't the fire. It was too far to the left, just at the edge of the trees. The sound of something stepping on dry leaves, moving slowly. I sat still, holding my breath. The sound stopped. Then, as if on cue, a twig snapped loudly. My heart jumped, and my fingers tightened around the knife that rested beside me on the ground. I stared into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. It was quiet again, but the air felt heavier somehow. The forest, which had felt like a sanctuary before, now felt wrong, as if I wasn't supposed to be here. It was probably nothing, I told myself. A raccoon, a deer, maybe even a bird hopping around on the ground. But that thought didn't bring me any comfort. Something in my gut told me that wasn't the case. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the nearby trees and the space around my tent. But there was nothing, no movement, just the usual shadows and the soft glow of the fire. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. I sat back down by the fire, trying to shake off the sensation that I wasn't alone. I told myself again it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The forest can be a strange place at night, especially when you're alone. It makes you paranoid. I kept my eyes on the fire and tried to relax, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every now and then, I'd hear another snap of a twig or rustling from the trees. But when I shone the flashlight in that direction, it was always empty. It wasn't until I heard the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush that I truly began to panic. They were slow, deliberate steps, not like an animal, but like a person. Someone was out there, moving toward me. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. My heart pounded in my ears as I listened. The steps were coming closer, growing louder with each passing second. My hands shook as I reached for the knife again, gripping it tightly in my palm. I didn't know what was out there, but I had to be ready. The footsteps stopped just outside the light's reach. I couldn't see anything. No movement, no shape, just the darkness. I tried to steady my breath, trying not to make a sound, but the quiet was suffocating. Time stretched, feeling like it had stopped entirely. The fire crackled loudly, and I wondered if the sound would give me away. The next thing I heard was a low, raspy breath. It wasn't an animal, it was too deep, too human. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and my pulse raced in my throat. The sound came from just beyond the firelight. It was close. I had to do something. I stood up quickly, turning on the flashlight and pointing it in the direction of the sound. The beam swept across the trees, catching only branches and leaves, but there was no one. No shape, no figure, just the darkness and the faint outline of the woods. I stood there, breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was going on? I waited for a moment, but there was no further sound, no movement. I took a shaky step forward, still holding the knife tightly. My eyes darted across the clearing, scanning for anything unusual. The only noise was the crackling of the fire and the distant rush of water from the stream. It felt like hours before I was able to breathe normally again. Finally, I shook my head and forced myself to sit back down, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the darkness, it all messes with your head. I had to calm down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I stayed up for hours watching the trees, waiting for another sound, but nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I crawled into my tent. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I heard the slightest rustle, I was awake, gripping the knife and listening intently. But the night passed without incident, and the morning came without further disturbances. I packed up and left the next morning, not staying to try and find out what had happened. I couldn't explain it. All I knew was that I didn't want to be there any longer. The forest that had felt so peaceful the night before now felt hostile and unwelcoming. And I've never gone back. I had been camping alone before, but this time felt different. It wasn't that the forest was any scarier than usual or that something about the air seemed off. No, it was just me. The quiet, solitary feeling that comes when you're entirely alone in the middle of nowhere. My friends were busy with work, and I needed some time to clear my head. So I decided to take a solo trip to a remote spot I had discovered last summer. It wasn't far from home, just deep enough in the woods to feel isolated, but close enough that I could easily make it back if something went wrong. At least that was the plan. I drove up a winding mountain road, the trees thickening around me as I moved further into the forest. The road got rougher as I neared the trailhead, and the GPS signal began to fade. That was fine. I wasn't in a hurry. I had everything I needed: food, water, my tent, and a reliable knife just in case. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the path as I unloaded my gear and started hiking toward my campsite. The trail was easy to follow, though it had been a while since anyone had used it. I hadn't seen another soul all day. That didn't bother me. I preferred being alone. The hike wasn't particularly strenuous, but the stillness of the forest made it feel like the air was heavier. The crunch of my boots on the dry leaves was the only sound that broke the silence, and I found myself occasionally pausing to listen. There was something about the quiet that made me uneasy, but I brushed it off. I finally arrived at the clearing where I planned to camp. It was a beautiful spot, with a small creek running through the middle and surrounded by tall, dense trees. The kind of place that looked peaceful in daylight but might be unsettling at night. I set up my tent near the creek, unpacked my gear, and started a fire. The crackle of the flames was the only thing that kept the dark quiet at bay, but as the evening wore on, the chill of the night began creeping in. The forest around me seemed to grow even quieter, and the shadows from the trees seemed to stretch longer. As the fire flickered and I ate my dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't anything specific. It wasn't like I had heard any strange noises or seen anything out of the ordinary. It was just a nagging sense that I wasn't alone. I tried to ignore it. I'd been camping enough to know that the mind can play tricks on you when you're out here by yourself. The night deepened, and I eventually crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and settled into my sleeping bag. I tried to focus on the sound of the creek outside and the crackling of the fire, but my mind kept wandering. My thoughts were muddled. Was I imagining things? Every rustle of leaves outside, every creak of the trees, made me pause and listen, but nothing came. Hours passed, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the soft gurgle of the creek. I stretched, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, fresh, and cool, perfect for a hike. As I looked around the campsite, though, something caught my eye. There, just a few feet from my tent, were two long, deep grooves in the earth. At first, I thought they might be from an animal, maybe a deer or something bigger, but no animal I knew of would leave tracks like that. These were too deep, too deliberate. The grooves ran in a straight line, from the edge of the clearing into the trees. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach tightening. Something about the way they were cut into the ground felt wrong. It wasn't natural. I dismissed it as my imagination again. Maybe a branch had fallen during the night and dragged along the ground. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night had felt off. I packed up my things quickly, anxious to get moving. The sooner I could get back on the trail, the better. The hike back was uneventful for the most part, but as I walked, I couldn't stop glancing behind me. The woods had an oppressive stillness to them, like they were watching, waiting. Every time I looked over my shoulder, though, There was nothing. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the irrational thoughts, but they kept creeping in. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I reached the trailhead and made my way back to the car. Relief flooded me as I saw my vehicle in the distance, but that sense of unease didn't leave. I started the engine and drove down the winding road, glancing back at the forest once more. The trees stood tall, silent, and dark. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I finally felt my shoulders relax. That should have been the end of it. I'd gone camping, I'd gotten a little spooked, and I'd gotten back safe. But something kept gnawing at me. I couldn't stop thinking about those grooves. I couldn't stop thinking about how, even in the daylight, the forest felt wrong. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see something or someone following me. I didn't tell anyone about the trip when I got home. I didn't think they'd believe me, and I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But over the next few days, the unease lingered. I couldn't sleep right, and the sound of every little crack and groan in the house felt like it was coming from just behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something important, back at the campsite. 1 week later, I decided I had to go back. I told myself it was just for closure, to prove to myself that nothing had really happened. So, I packed up again and drove back to the same spot. The weather had changed since my first visit. The trees were bare now, their leaves scattered on the ground. It was even quieter than I remembered. I reached the clearing and parked the car. The site looked exactly the same as before, but somehow it felt different, more imposing, like the forest was holding its breath. I walked over to where I had set up my tent before. The grooves were still there, but now they were even deeper, and they seemed to lead in a different direction than before. My heart started racing, and I immediately felt the first pangs of dread. This wasn't right. I followed the grooves, trying to make sense of them. The ground was soft from the rain, and I could see where something had dragged along the earth. It led me deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone. After a few minutes, I found myself standing in front of a strange, circular clearing I hadn't noticed before. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a pile of rocks arranged in a neat circle. Inside the circle were scraps of cloth, ripped, faded fabric, some of it red, some of it black. My mind raced. I'd been on this trail before, and I had never seen anything like this. A sudden chill ran down my spine, and I had an overwhelming urge to leave. I turned to head back, but that's when I heard something. A soft thud, like something heavy being dropped. I froze in place, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, but there was nothing else. No footsteps, no movement, just silence. I didn't wait around. I turned and ran as fast as I could back to the car, feeling like something was right behind me. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, its oppressive silence weighing down on me. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. I slammed the door, started the engine, and sped out of there. The drive home was a blur. I didn't look back. It's been weeks since I left that place, but the feeling hasn't gone away. I'm not going back, not ever. The forest has its secrets, and I'm no longer interested in uncovering them. Maybe I imagined everything. The grooves, the clearing, the strange feeling of being watched. Maybe it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. But every time I close my eyes, I can still see that pile of rocks and the scraps of cloth. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear a soft thud in the distance, like something heavy is being dropped. It started as a simple weekend getaway, a chance to disconnect from the noise of everyday life and spend some time in nature. I had been feeling burned out from work and the constant buzz of social media, so when I saw an old camping site upstate that had good reviews, I thought it would be the perfect escape. I packed my car the night before, tent, sleeping bag, some food, and a few other essentials. Nothing too fancy. The plan was to spend 2 nights in the woods, maybe go on a hike, relax, and just enjoy the solitude. The drive up was peaceful. The roads were quiet. The trees lining either side of the highway gave everything a calm, almost nostalgic feel. I got there by late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The campsite itself was tucked away in a remote part of the forest. It wasn't too far from civilization, but it felt isolated enough to give that sense of being in the middle of nowhere. I pulled up to the entrance, a small gravel road leading into the site. There was a wooden sign hanging crookedly, the letters fading but still legible, Pine Ridge Campsite. It had a sort of rustic charm to it. I drove past the ranger station, which was unmanned, and found my spot in the clearing. There were a few other campers scattered around the site, but not many. Just a couple of tents, a few campers in RVs. It was quiet, peaceful. The kind of quiet where you could hear the birds and the wind rustling through the trees. Perfect, I thought. I set up my tent in a secluded spot near the edge of the clearing, a little away from the other campers. I wasn't really in the mood to talk to anyone. I wanted to enjoy the solitude, just me and the wilderness. I built a small fire with the wood I had brought, roasted a couple of marshmallows, and had some dinner. The evening passed in peaceful silence, with the sounds of the forest filling the air. As the sun dipped lower, the darkness grew thicker around me. The fire crackled and popped, but as the night deepened, I began to feel a subtle unease. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling. The kind of feeling that creeps up on you when you're in a place so quiet, so removed from everything familiar. The woods, though beautiful, began to feel different. The shadows seemed deeper, the trees taller, and the darkness pressed in on me in a way that was hard to explain. I shook it off. I was just tired, that's all. The fire was warm, the food was good, and the stars above me were incredible. There was no reason to feel anxious. But when I went to bed, that strange feeling lingered. The tent was small, and I could hear every sound from outside. Every twig that cracked, every leaf that rustled, the distant hoot of an owl. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It was almost as though the forest was alive, watching me. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, sometime in the middle of the night, something happened. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It was a soft rustling, like something was brushing against the fabric. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it got louder, closer. It wasn't the wind. Someone or something was out there. I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again, this time closer, almost right by the tent. I could hear a faint scraping sound, as if someone or something was dragging something along the ground. My heart started pounding. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, my hands trembling. I shined it out through the thin fabric of the tent, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the dark outline of the trees and the soft glow of the campfire still flickering in the distance. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon. After all, this was their home. They were probably just curious. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, listening for any sign of movement. But all I could hear was the beating of my own heart and the rustling of the wind in the trees. Slowly, I allowed myself to relax again. The sounds faded away, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to find everything seemingly fine. The tent was intact. My gear was all where I'd left it. The sun was up, and the campsite had come alive with the sounds of other campers stirring. I was still a little on edge, but I pushed the feeling down. It was probably nothing, right? I spent most of the day hiking through the woods, taking in the sights and smells of the forest. The air was fresh, the trees towering above me, the ground soft beneath my feet. I couldn't deny that it was beautiful, but every now and then, that same sense of unease crept up again, like someone was following me. I would glance over my shoulder and find nothing. I brushed it off again. My mind was just playing tricks on me. By the time I made it back to the campsite, the sun was beginning to set. I gathered some more wood for the fire and settled in for the night. The atmosphere was different now, though. It felt heavier. The woods felt deeper, darker, like something was lurking just beyond the reach of the campfire's light. I stayed by the fire for a while, just staring into the flames, my mind wandering. The night was still and quiet, but that strange feeling, like I wasn't alone, had returned. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed early. I didn't feel like staying up, especially with the weird vibes I'd been getting. I zipped myself into the tent, trying to ignore the growing feeling of dread in my chest. But then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. A rustling, close. This time, I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight, unzipped the tent, and darted outside, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing. There was nothing there, just the usual shadows and trees. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found on the ground next to my tent. A single footprint, a large one, too large to be from any animal I could recognize. And it was fresh, recent. My blood ran cold. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and there were no signs of anyone being nearby when I went to sleep. The campsite was supposed to be secluded, but someone had been watching me, and they were close, too close. I didn't waste any more time. I packed up my stuff in a hurry, throwing things into my car. I wasn't going to stick around to find out who or what had been out there. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. That footprint was enough to make my skin crawl. I didn't want to wait and see what else would happen. I drove away from Pine Ridge campsite faster than I've ever driven in my life, not looking back. As I hit the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone in the distance, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me. By the time I got home, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The city was noisy, crowded, and overwhelming, but it was safe. I was safe, but there's a lingering thought that haunts me still. What if it wasn't over? What if someone was following me the whole time? The rustling outside the tent, the footprint, it wasn't a coincidence. I know that now. I don't know who or what it was, but I was being watched, and that's something I'll never forget. I haven't been back to Pine Ridge since, and I don't think I ever will. The woods have a way of keeping secrets, secrets that are better left undisturbed. I had always loved the outdoors. Growing up, I spent summers camping with my family. Just the simple joys of setting up a tent, building a fire, and staring up at the stars. The crackling sounds of the fire and the smell of pine trees, they had always given me a sense of peace. But now, as an adult, I craved something more, something alone, where I could be far from anyone, truly lost in nature. So, I decided to go on a solo camping trip somewhere remote. The place I chose was a forest about 3 hours from my house, tucked away from the usual trails. It was secluded enough that I wouldn't encounter other campers, but still accessible by a dirt road. My plan was simple. Hike in, set up camp, and just spend the night there. No electronics, no distractions. Just me and the forest. I packed my gear the night before. A lightweight tent, sleeping bag, stove, some canned food, a few snacks, and a knife for safety. I didn't expect anything to go wrong, but I figured it was better to be prepared. I left early the next morning, the sky still gray with the early light of dawn. The drive was smooth, and when I arrived at the trailhead, it felt like I was the only one in the world. The trail was barely marked, the trees dense and thick. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of wet earth and pine. The path seemed inviting, and I felt that familiar buzz of excitement, the kind you get before starting an adventure. I made sure my phone was off, as I didn't want to be distracted. The forest was so quiet that the sound of my boots crunching on the dried leaves felt oddly loud. The hike in was easier than I expected. The terrain wasn't too rough, though I did have to step over some fallen branches and navigate through thick underbrush. After about an hour, I reached a clearing, a small area with a few large rocks and a small stream running through it. This seemed like a perfect spot for the night. I unloaded my gear and set up my tent, enjoying the quiet solitude. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, I started a fire. The crackling flames lit up the surrounding woods, and I could hear the occasional rustle of animals moving through the brush. Nothing out of the ordinary. I cooked a simple dinner, just some beans and rice, and then sat back, eating slowly, enjoying the calm. The night had settled in, and the forest was alive with sounds. Distant calls of owls, the occasional snap of a twig, and the wind whispering through the trees. But something started to gnaw at me. It was subtle at first, just a vague sense of unease. I tried to ignore it, but the quiet kept amplifying it. The wind died down, and the sounds of the forest faded away. It became eerily still. The only noise now was the crackle of the fire and the rustling of the leaves around me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a normal shift in the environment. But the silence was oppressive. It felt like the world had drawn in closer around me, holding its breath. I was alone in a big forest, with nothing but my thoughts to keep me company. And the thought, for some reason, began to make me uneasy. The thought that I was alone, truly alone, gnawed at me. There were no sounds of animals nearby anymore, no birds or small creatures. Even the wind had stopped. It was just quiet, too quiet. I sat there for a while, staring at the fire, watching the flickering flames and the occasional spark float up into the darkening sky. My mind wandered, but the creeping sense of being watched wouldn't go away. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. After all, it was easy to let your mind wander when you were alone in the woods. Eventually, I decided to turn in for the night. The sky above was clear, revealing a blanket of stars. I zipped myself into my tent and tried to get some sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound outside made me jump. Crunching leaves, snapping twigs, a distant howl. I turned over in my sleeping bag, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. At one point in the night, I woke up suddenly, wide awake. It was pitch black, and the fire had died down to just embers. My heart was pounding, my senses on high alert. Something wasn't right. I listened carefully, straining to hear even the faintest sound. The silence was absolute. Not a single animal made a noise. And then I heard it, a rustling noise just beyond the edge of the trees. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the normal sounds of the forest. It was too deliberate, too close. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. The rustling grew louder, closer. Someone or something was out there. My mind raced. What could it be? Person? A wild animal? I had no idea, but the fear was overwhelming. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there, frozen, listening to the sounds creeping closer. The rustling stopped just beyond my tent. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Was it watching me, waiting for me to make a move? I wanted to shout, to call out, but the fear of whatever was out there kept me silent. Time seemed to stretch on forever. Minutes passed like hours. The silence returned, but the fear remained, a thick knot in my stomach. I waited for what felt like an eternity, until I finally summoned the courage to unzip the tent just enough to peer outside. Nothing. The clearing was empty, bathed in the dim light of the dying embers. The fire had gone out completely, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I sat there for a while, too terrified to move, but nothing happened. No movement, no sound. Slowly, I exhaled, realizing that I had been holding my breath the entire time. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was a raccoon or some other animal. I wasn't sure, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I packed up quickly, trying not to make too much noise, too much of a disturbance. I was done with this trip. I decided to hike back to the car immediately. The night was dark, and the trail was barely visible in the moonlight. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of the forest. I didn't want to spend another second alone in that place. The hike back felt like it took forever. I kept hearing strange noises, footsteps, twigs snapping, rustling, and every time I turned around, nothing was there. The forest was still, unnervingly so. The trees loomed over me, their shadows stretching out in the dim light, as though they were watching me, waiting for something. When I finally reached the trailhead, the relief that flooded through me was overwhelming. I couldn't get in my car fast enough. As I drove away, the road winding through the forest, I glanced into the rearview mirror. I don't know what I expected to see, but I half expected to see something there. Something lurking in the shadows of the trees, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the darkness of the forest. As I drove back to the safety of civilization, I couldn't help but think about what happened. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, the result of being alone in the woods for too long. Maybe it was nothing, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never camp there again. There was something about that place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, something that made me feel like I wasn't alone, even when I should have been. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe there was something more to it. I'll never know, but what I do know is this: I never went back. And sometimes, even when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the faint rustling of leaves just beyond the trees. I never thought much about camping alone. I'd been on a few trips with friends, and everything went smoothly. The woods were always peaceful, and the campfires we built crackled in harmony with the natural sounds around us. So when I decided to go solo, I wasn't expecting any trouble. In fact, I looked forward to the quiet. No chatter, no distractions, just the sound of my footsteps in the dirt, the rustling of leaves, and the crackle of my own campfire. I drove out to a forested area a few hours outside the city, a place I knew well. It wasn't particularly remote, but it wasn't a popular camping spot either. The kind of place where you could set up your tent, build a fire, and not see another soul for days. That's exactly what I was after. I needed the solitude. Setting up camp was the usual routine. I chose a site near a small creek, the sound of the water making me feel at ease. The evening was cool, but not cold, perfect for a camping trip. I built my tent quickly, dug a small fire pit, and set up my stove. As I unpacked my gear, I noticed the place seemed oddly quiet. Usually, you'd hear birds or squirrels moving about, but there was none of that. No matter, I thought. It was still early, and the day's heat might have kept the animals in hiding. I started the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle. I had a simple meal planned: canned chili and some bread. I'd always liked the simplicity of camp food, even if it wasn't gourmet. There's something about eating outdoors that makes even the most basic meal feel satisfying. As the sun dipped lower behind the trees, the woods started to feel different. There was no real danger in the area, I told myself, but a slight unease crept over me. The wind picked up, and for the first time that evening, I heard something, twigs snapping in the distance. At first, I dismissed it as an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon moving through the underbrush. But the noise was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I sat still, listening carefully. Then it stopped. The forest was suddenly unnervingly quiet. I glanced around, trying to spot any movement, but everything was still. The unease didn't go away. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was nothing. I had been alone in the woods before many times, but something about the silence, the heavy, suffocating silence, didn't sit right. The fire crackled, and the wind picked up again, but it felt like it was coming from the wrong direction, blowing toward me instead of away. I finished my meal quickly and went to bed early, hoping the sleep would clear my mind. The tent was small, but I didn't mind. I had brought only what I needed, and it felt safe in there. The night was cool, but I had enough layers to keep warm. As I settled in, I tried to ignore the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing things outside the tent. More twigs snapping, something rustling in the underbrush. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then the sounds became too regular, too close. And every now and then, there was a faint whisper of movement around the edges of my tent. My mind raced, and I couldn't help but feel that I wasn't alone. I lay there for hours, barely sleeping, trying to ignore the sounds. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. The hours stretched on, and the sounds came and went, never allowing me to truly relax. I kept telling myself that it was just wildlife, that I was being irrational. Then, just as I was about to drift into a light sleep, I heard it, a soft knock coming from the side of the tent. It wasn't loud, just a gentle tap, like someone tapping their finger on the fabric. I froze. I didn't move, couldn't. I held my breath, straining to hear any other sound. But all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The knock came again. This time it was louder. I could hear the rustling of something moving just outside, slow and deliberate. I didn't know what to do. My phone was in my bag, just out of reach, and I didn't want to make any noise to give away my position. I thought about grabbing the knife I kept in my camping gear, but the thought of opening the tent and facing whatever was out there paralyzed me. The tapping came again, this time accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible scraping sound, like something dragging against the earth. I felt a cold sweat bead on the back of my neck. This wasn't normal. I was no longer convinced this was just an animal. I lay there, my mind racing. I could hear my breath, shallow and fast, but I was determined not to give in to panic. I told myself it was probably someone else camping nearby, messing with me, but the thought of anyone else being out here, this far off the beaten path, seemed strange. I don't know how long I lay there trying to figure out what to do. It felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. My mind was spinning. Could it be another camper? Or was it someone who didn't belong here? I tried to push the thought of a person out of my mind. I told myself it was just the wind, the night playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving around my tent. The noise was soft, but unmistakable. Someone was walking around me. I didn't know what to think, what to do. My breath quickened. My hands were shaking. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to do something. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening to the footsteps move around the tent. I wanted to scream, to call out, but something told me that would only make it worse. I had to stay silent, stay hidden. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I held my breath, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But then came the worst sound yet. Scraping against the side of my tent, something sharp dragging along the fabric. It was deliberate, purposeful. I could feel my heart in my throat, but I had no choice now. I grabbed my backpack, silently reached for my knife, and prepared myself. I wasn't about to go down without a fight. My mind was racing. Should I cut my way out? No, that would be too obvious. What if they were waiting for that? I decided to wait, hoping they would leave. but the scraping continued, relentless. It was coming from different sides of the tent now, as if whatever it was circling me. It felt like an eternity, but finally, the noise stopped. I lay there in the silence, waiting for any sign that the danger had passed. Minutes went by, maybe longer. Couldn't tell. My mind was racing, but all I could do was wait. Then, a small voice in the back of my mind told me to leave. Get up, pack up, and get out. Don't wait, just go. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my gear, shoved it into my backpack, and carefully opened the tent flap. I peeked out, my heart pounding in my chest. The area around me was empty. The fire had long since died down, and the only sound was the distant creak. For a moment, I thought I had imagined the whole thing. I didn't care. I wasn't staying another minute. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking as I stuffed everything into my bag. I didn't look back. I just started walking, away from the campsite, toward the nearest road. I didn't care how far it was. I just needed to get away. By the time I reached the road, it was nearly dawn. The first light of morning broke through the trees, but I didn't feel relieved. I had no idea what I had just experienced, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back there. As I sat by the side of the road, waiting for someone to drive by, I reflected on what happened. Maybe it was a person, maybe it wasn't, but I wasn't going to take the chance. I didn't go camping again for a long time. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful camping trip. Just me and a couple of friends out in the woods. A weekend to escape the chaos of city life. The kind of trip you tell yourself will recharge your batteries, clear your mind, and leave you with a sense of calm. But by the end of it, I realized how little I knew about the woods and how much I took for granted when it came to safety and comfort. Sometimes the wilderness doesn't care about your plans, and it has a way of reminding you that you're just a small part of a much bigger world. The trip started off well enough. We'd been hiking for a few hours, the sun still high, beating down on our backs as we trudged along the narrow trail. The forest around us was dense. Tall, thick trees with dark green leaves that barely let the sunlight through. It was beautiful, but it also felt like we were entering a place that had been around long before we ever showed up. There's something about a forest like that, where you feel small, insignificant, like a visitor in someone else's home. We found a good spot by a creek, just far enough off the trail so we wouldn't be disturbed, but close enough to the water for a good view. The sound of the running water was soothing, and we set up our tents in a small clearing near the bank. There was a chill in the air, and the evening light started to fade. I had to admit, it felt nice to be away from the noise and distractions of everyday life. The first night was calm. We sat around the fire, chatting, cooking dinner, and sharing stories. The kind of night you expect when you're camping, nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual crackle of the fire, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. But as the night wore on and the darkness settled in, I started to feel a little uneasy. It was subtle at first, nothing I could put my finger on, but I knew that something wasn't right. At some point, everyone else went to bed, and I stayed up for a bit, watching the fire burn low. The woods were quiet now, eerily so. The crickets had stopped chirping, the owls had fallen silent. It was like the forest itself had paused, waiting for something. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Eventually, I decided to turn in. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to settle in for sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The air outside seemed heavier now, and I could hear the faintest creaking sound coming from the trees around us. I assumed it was just the wind, but it sounded different, distant and irregular, like something was moving in the forest, something large. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the forest doing its thing. But then I heard it again, a twig snapping, not far from our camp. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but something about it felt deliberate, like it wasn't just some animal moving around in the woods. It felt like something or someone was out there, watching us. I lay still in my sleeping bag, straining my ears to catch any more sounds. It was dead quiet for a while. I almost started to relax again, convincing myself I was just being paranoid, when I heard a faint rustling near the edge of the camp. My stomach tightened. It was definitely too close to be an animal. I slowly unzipped my tent just a little, careful not to make any noise. I peeked out, trying to see if anything was there. The fire was low now, casting long, eerie shadows across the trees, but there was nothing in the clearing. The rustling stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but the sound didn't return. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, though. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, but I couldn't fall asleep. Every little sound outside seemed amplified in the silence of the forest. And then, just as I thought I might drift off, I heard it again. A sharp, deliberate crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. My heart hammered in my chest. It was definitely closer this time. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, slowly unzipped the tent again, and stepped out into the cool night air. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, and I scanned the area around us. Nothing, no movement, but the unease in my gut only grew. I didn't want to wake the others. They'd think I was overreacting, and honestly, I wasn't sure what I'd say if I did wake them. I stood there for a few moments, listening to the silence. My mind raced. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a part of the forest, something natural. But why did it feel like someone or something was out there? My pulse raced, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned to go back to my tent, but that's when I heard something I couldn't ignore. Faint, low whisper. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, carried on the wind. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough that I could make it out. It wasn't words exactly, more like a hissing sound, soft and almost melodic. I froze. The whisper seemed to be calling my name. No, that was ridiculous. I was imagining things. But the whisper came again, this time a little louder. It was faint, but definitely there. I wanted to run, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My body was frozen in place, caught between fear and a desperate curiosity. The whisper stopped, and for a moment, there was only the sound of my own heavy breathing. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the rustling in the trees began again. Closer this time. It was too much. I turned and bolted back to the tent, zipping myself inside. My heart was pounding. I laid there for what felt like hours, unable to sleep, unable to move, just listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The others were still asleep, so I decided to head down to the creek to clear my head. The air was crisp, the sun barely peeking through the trees as I sat on a rock, staring at the water. I tried to tell myself it had all been some weird coincidence. But then something caught my eye, a footprint, half covered by the brush near the water's edge. It was large, much too large to be from any animal I knew of. The print was deep, as if something heavy had stepped there, and there was something strange about the way the earth had been disturbed. It looked fresh, like it had been made only hours ago. My stomach sank. I wasn't alone. I took one last look around the creek, my mind racing with possibilities. What was out here? Who had been following us through the woods? Was it someone else or something else? I walked back to camp quickly, trying not to panic. When I returned, the others were awake, packing up, completely unaware of the tension in the air. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. We left the campsite not looking back. As we made our way out of the woods, the oppressive feeling finally began to lift. I couldn't explain what had happened that night, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never look at the woods the same way again. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the woods had started to settle into that eerie quietness that only comes with nightfall. The light from my campfire flickered weakly, casting long, twisting shadows on the trees around me. It wasn't cold, but there was something unsettling about the stillness. My backpack, still half open, was lying in the dirt near the edge of my tent, which was set up at the edge of a small clearing. I was alone in the woods, just me and the wild, or so I thought. I had decided to take a solo camping trip to get away from everything for a few days. I'd been stressed out recently, work had been overwhelming, and I just needed some time in nature to reset. I wasn't an expert camper by any means, but I had enough experience to set up a fire, pitch a tent, and keep myself safe. At least that's what I thought. The fire crackled as I sat down on a nearby log, stirring the small pot of stew I'd been heating over the flames. The scent of the food mixed with the piney smell of the forest, and for a moment, everything felt normal, comfortable even. The stars were starting to poke through the gaps in the treetops, and the air was thick with the sound of rustling leaves and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. I'd chosen this particular spot because it was secluded. I didn't want to deal with other campers or hikers. It was just me, my fire, and the woods. Perfect retreat. But as I sat there, stirring my stew, I started to feel off. First, I thought it was just nerves. I'd been alone in the woods before, but something tonight felt different. The air seemed heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Could have been the fact that it was my first night in a while, or maybe the quiet was starting to get to me. I glanced around, scanning the darkness that stretched out from the clearing. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper than they should have been, as if they were stretching just beyond the reach of the firelight. The wind had picked up a little, but there wasn't enough to explain the strange feeling that crawled up my spine. My hand tightened on the spoon I was holding, and I glanced toward the sound of leaves crunching in the distance. My eyes narrowed, trying to make sense of the shadows. Nothing. I tried to shake off the weird sensation, but my heart kept racing a little faster than usual. There was a subtle noise, too, a rustling, like something was moving just outside the light of the fire. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some small creature scurrying around. Still, I couldn't help but feel a prickle of unease crawl up my neck. It didn't help that I hadn't seen any signs of wildlife since I'd arrived. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. In the back of my mind, a thought flickered. One I tried to ignore, but it wouldn't go away. What if I wasn't alone out here? I brushed the thought aside. I was just being paranoid. The woods were full of animals, not people. I had seen some signs of animal tracks earlier when I had hiked around the area, but there was nothing to indicate any human activity. Just to be sure, I grabbed my knife from my belt and kept it close, hidden in my lap as I ate. The fire crackled louder, and I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, eating. But the feeling wouldn't go away. A rustling noise came again, and this time it was closer. I tensed, my eyes snapping toward the tree-line. Nothing.it was probably just a raccoon or something, but my imagination had started running wild. The quietness of the forest was beginning to get to me. In the city, there was noise all the time, cars, people, sirens, but out here, in the deep woods, the silence felt suffocating. I finished my stew and tossed the bowl aside, deciding it was time to get into the tent. I didn't want to keep sitting by the fire. The unease was gnawing at me now, and I needed to sleep. A little rest, I thought, and I'd feel better in the morning. I stood up and kicked dirt over the fire, extinguishing it. The forest around me was now a wall of blackness, the only light coming from the faint glow of my lantern, which I'd left inside the tent. My heart pounded louder as I stepped toward the tent, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. It was probably nothing, just nerves. As I unzipped the tent and crawled inside, I took one last look at the clearing. The faint rustling sounds had stopped. I zipped the tent closed behind me and lay down on my sleeping pad. The night seemed quieter inside the tent, more comforting, and I began to relax. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, footsteps, scratching. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I tried to ignore it, but the sounds were getting louder, closer. And then a voice, soft, almost too soft to hear, whispered just outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart now racing. My eyes went wide in the darkness. Was it someone out there? I told myself I was just hearing things, that it was just the wind. But the whispering came again. This time it was louder, more distinct. It sounded like someone was standing right outside the tent, barely breathing. I stayed completely still, hoping they couldn't hear me move. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest, but I forced it back. My mind raced. Was I overreacting? Was someone really out there? Or was it just my fear taking over? Then I heard it, a sharp, unmistakable sound. A knock. Someone was knocking on the side of my tent. Once, twice, my breath hitched, and for a second, I just lay there frozen, unable to move. It didn't make sense. Who would be out here in the woods, knocking on someone's tent in the dead of night? I held my breath, straining my ears. The knocking stopped. The silence seemed to stretch on forever. And then, a voice again, low and menacing. "I know you're in there." My heart hammered in my chest. It was real. Someone was out there. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront them? Should I try to call for help? I had no cell service out here. I was on my own. I waited for a few minutes, but the person didn't say anything else. The knocking stopped. It was as if they had just disappeared. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What was going on? Who was out there? Why hadn't they tried to break in? What were they waiting for? Morning finally came, but it didn't bring the sense of relief I'd hoped for. When I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the clearing looked normal. No signs of anyone having been here. The ground was undisturbed, the trees still, and there were no footprints near my tent. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where the knocking had come from, wondering if I had imagined it all. Maybe it was an animal, some kind of trick of the mind, but I knew it wasn't. The voice, the knock, they had been real. I packed up my camp quickly, the unease still gnawing at my stomach. As I left the clearing, I glanced back once more, feeling like I wasn't alone. Something wasn't right about this place, but there was no turning back now. As I hiked out of the woods, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but I never saw anything. When I reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. The woods had been beautiful, yes, but they had also held something I couldn't quite explain. I wasn't sure what had happened, but I knew one thing. I would never camp there again. The woods were too quiet, too still, and some things should never be disturbed. I've always loved camping. Ever since I was a kid, the idea of spending a few nights in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sounds of nature, had always brought me peace. So, when I got the chance to head out for a solo camping trip this summer, I jumped at the opportunity. It was going to be a break from the noise of the city, from people, from everything. Just me, the forest, and the quiet. I thought it would be perfect. I'd found a little-known spot up in the mountains, far enough off the beaten path that it was unlikely anyone else would be around. a place where the trees were thick and the trails were quiet. I drove out there alone with just my backpack, tent, and a few supplies. I didn't need much. I figured it was a simple enough plan. Pitch the tent, start a fire, and enjoy the evening. The road leading up to the campsite was narrow and winding, with steep cliffs on one side and dense trees on the other. The air smelled fresh, filled with the earthy scent of pine and dirt. I pulled off the road and into a small clearing, just big enough for a tent. The spot was perfect, secluded and peaceful. There was a little stream nearby that bubbled gently, the sound of running water giving the place a calming, almost magical feeling. I set up camp, pitched my tent, and gathered some firewood. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over everything. I started a fire and sat back, watching the flames flicker. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees, the distant chirping of crickets, and the soft gurgle of the stream. It was exactly what I had hoped for. I made a cup of tea, leaned back against a tree, and let the stillness wash over me. But as the night grew darker, I started to notice something odd. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things, little details that seemed off. The rustling of leaves in the distance sounded different, more deliberate. And then there was the feeling. You know that sense when you're out in the wilderness and you can't shake the feeling that you're being watched? I'd never really had that before, not like this. First, I tried to brush it off. I was alone in the woods, after all. I had always heard that it's easy to imagine things in the quiet of the night. But the feeling grew stronger. The shadows in the trees seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. I couldn't see anything clearly, but my mind kept playing tricks on me. Every so often, I thought I saw something, a figure, a flash of movement. But when I looked, there was nothing there. The fire crackled and I added a few more logs, but it didn't seem to keep the darkness at bay the way it usually did. The woods felt deep now, more enclosed. The occasional animal noises, the calls of birds and insects, seemed to have quieted down, as though the whole forest was holding its breath. I kept my eyes trained on the trees, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, just my imagination. I stood up, deciding to walk down to the stream for a minute, just to stretch my legs. Maybe it would clear my head. The night was cold now, and the crisp air nipped at my skin. The stream was barely visible in the dim light of my headlamp, but I could hear it, the water gently flowing over rocks. I knelt by the edge for a moment, listening to the peaceful sound of the stream. That was when I heard it. A twig snapped, a sharp, distinct sound in the silence of the woods. My head shot up and I froze. My heart started pounding. I wasn't alone. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was an animal. I had heard deer were common in these woods. Or maybe it was the wind causing a branch to shift. But I wasn't convinced. The sound had come from further down the path, off to the left, just beyond the range of my headlamp. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't move for a long time. The night seemed unnaturally still. Not a single other sound. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. Just the steady flow of the stream. I told myself it was nothing, probably a raccoon or some other animal out foraging. But the feeling, the sensation of being watched intensified. It was suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, I finally decided to head back to camp. I stood up slowly, keeping my senses alert. The woods had never felt so alive in their silence, and I was acutely aware of every movement, every noise. My headlamp swept across the trees, illuminating their twisted, gnarled branches. The shadows were long, shifting in strange ways, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of view, lurking, waiting. As I walked back to my camp, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few steps, expecting to see someone or something following me. But there was nothing there, just the empty woods stretching out behind me. Still, I quickened my pace. When I reached my tent, I made sure to zip it up tightly, double-checking that everything was secure. I threw another log on the fire, and its warmth was a brief comfort. But I couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at me. The stillness, the quiet, it felt wrong now. I sat near the fire for a while, staring into the flames, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each minute heavier than the last. Eventually, exhaustion started to creep in. I was tired both physically and mentally. I'd convinced myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I decided to crawl into my sleeping bag. I lay there, listening to the crackling fire and the occasional rustle in the trees. I tried to relax, to ignore the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. But sleep didn't come easily. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. Something had disturbed me. The air was still, unnervingly still, and I couldn't figure out what had woken me. My heart was racing. The fire was low now, only embers left, casting flickering shadows across the camp. The sky outside the tent was dark, the moon barely visible through the trees. I lay there, eyes wide open, listening. There was something out there, something moving. It wasn't the wind, I could tell the difference. The sound was too deliberate, too slow. It was close, too close. I slowly unzipped the tent, just a little to peek outside. My breath caught in my throat when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, just outside the reach of the firelight, were footprints. Large, uneven prints in the dirt, leading up to my camp. They weren't animal tracks. These were human tracks. My mind raced, my body frozen in fear. My first thought was that I wasn't alone. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been close the whole time. But who and why? I grabbed my flashlight, holding it tightly in my shaking hands, and stepped out of the tent. The fire was nearly out, casting only faint light on the ground. I swept the flashlight around the campsite. The area was empty, no sign of anyone. But the tracks, they were still there, leading off toward the woods, fading into the shadows. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what to do. Should I stay, or should I pack up and leave? I decided to stay. Something inside me told me that leaving now, running, would be the worst thing I could do. If someone had been out there, they knew where I was. But I also knew I couldn't let fear control me. Not in these woods. I spent the rest of the night with the fire blazing, watching the shadows, listening to the woods around me. I never saw anyone else, and eventually, the sounds of the forest returned to their normal rhythm. The chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. By morning, the feeling of dread had passed, and I convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. The tracks could have been from someone else, maybe a hiker or a hunter. I packed up and left the next morning, ready to head back to civilization. But as I walked back to my car, I found something that made my stomach turn. A small, weathered object was lying in the dirt near the trail. It was a watch, an old, beaten-up watch, the kind that someone would wear every day. It was close enough to the campsite to be connected, but I didn't want to think about it. I didn't stay any longer. I left the woods, and as I drove away, the unease that had haunted me all night began to fade. But I couldn't shake the thought that I had been closer to something far more dangerous than I ever realized. I don't remember exactly why I decided to go camping that weekend. Maybe it was the idea of escaping my usual routine, or maybe I just wanted some time to clear my mind. Either way, I ended up by myself, far away from the noise of city life. A small patch of wilderness was all I needed. Somewhere to set up my tent, start a fire, and forget about everything for a while. I had chosen a campsite deep in the forest, a place not far from a small, flowing creek. It seemed like a peaceful location, away from any busy trails or popular camping spots. I figured I'd be alone for the weekend, and that was exactly what I wanted. Setting up my tent took longer than I expected. The ground was uneven, and I had to move the tent a couple of times before I found the right spot. The trees around me stood tall, their branches stretching up toward the sky. They were thick with leaves, so much so that they blocked out most of the sun, casting everything in a soft, greenish light. It was peaceful, almost calming, except for the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. The campsite was basic: a tent, a small fire pit, a backpack with food, and some basic gear. I didn't have a lot with me. My plan was to keep things simple. I wasn't expecting any surprises. The fire pit had some old, half-burnt logs in it from previous campers, so I added a few more branches and started a small fire. The warmth from the flames felt good against the cool evening air, and I sat down on the ground, staring into the flickering flames. There was no one around. The forest was quiet except for the occasional sound of birds chirping in the distance or the rustle of leaves as animals moved around. I had brought a small camp stove, but the fire seemed like a better option for cooking. I opened my food bag and dug through it. I had some canned beans, a pack of trail mix, and a couple of energy bars. Nothing fancy. I wasn't in the mood for anything complicated. I just wanted something quick to eat. As I heated up the can of beans over the fire, the air around me seemed to shift. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something felt different, distant, almost as if the forest had suddenly grown quieter. The birds had stopped chirping, and the wind had slowed down. I shrugged it off at first. It was probably just my imagination. But then I heard something, a soft crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. It was coming from the direction of the creek. I didn't jump up, but I was immediately alert. It wasn't uncommon for animals to wander through the area, especially at night. I figured it was just some deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to focus on my meal, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the sound. After a few moments, I heard it again. Another twig snapped, but this time it was louder, more deliberate. My heart rate picked up, and my instincts told me to stay still, listen, and stay quiet. I glanced around the camp, but the fire was the only thing lighting up the area. The trees were dark and still. The creek, which had sounded so peaceful earlier, now felt distant, even eerie. The sound from that direction was still there, though slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone or something was walking through the forest. But who would be out here at this time? I felt a bit stupid for not thinking about this earlier. I was in the middle of nowhere, and anyone could be out here. Still, the thought of someone creeping around my campsite sent a chill through me. I tried to convince myself that it was probably just another camper or maybe an animal, but the idea didn't sit right with me. The next few minutes felt like hours. The crackling of the fire was the only sound I could hear, and the footsteps seemed to be getting closer. My mind raced, running through every possible scenario. What if someone was out there watching me? What if it wasn't just a person, but someone who was lost or in trouble? My imagination was running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the sound stopped. The forest grew still once again. I didn't know what to do. Should I call out? Should I grab my gear and leave? The thought of leaving in the middle of the night didn't appeal to me, but I also didn't feel safe staying here alone anymore. Just as I was about to make up my mind, I heard it, this time much closer. A twig snapped, not 20 feet from my camp. The firelight flickered in the shadows, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wasn't sure what I was seeing, but I didn't want to find out. I grabbed my flashlight, a bright beam cutting through the night. The woods around me were quiet again, but my skin tingled with the unsettling feeling that something was out there. Slowly, I scanned the area, shining the light across the trees, the ground, the edges of the camp. Nothing moved. No shadow, no figure, just the crackling of the fire and the stillness of the forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I was being watched, and it wasn't from a safe distance. Felt too close. The hours dragged on, and I eventually finished my meal. I hadn't made any more noise than necessary, and I didn't dare leave the camp to investigate further. The sky had darkened, and the stars were now visible through the gaps in the trees. I didn't feel like sleeping, but the exhaustion from the day was starting to settle in. Maybe I thought I was overreacting. I had no reason to believe anything was really out there. But as I settled into my sleeping bag that night, the sounds of the forest seemed louder, more pronounced. Couldn't relax. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me jump. I lay there in the dark, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't escape the feeling that something, or someone, was just beyond the reach of my firelight. I don't know when I finally fell asleep. I only know that when I woke up, it was still dark. The fire had long since burned down to embers, and the only sound I could hear was the soft gurgle of the creek in the distance. I thought I had heard something in the night, but I wasn't sure if it was a dream or reality. The memory was fuzzy, but I was certain I hadn't imagined the footsteps. I decided it was time to leave. There was something about the forest that no longer felt peaceful. The sense of being watched hadn't gone away, and I didn't want to take any chances. I packed up my camp quickly, shoving everything into my backpack without much care for organization. My tent was folded messily, and I didn't bother with the fire. I just wanted to get out of there. As I made my way back to the trailhead, the quietness of the forest felt oppressive. Every step I took seemed louder than it should have been, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift in strange ways. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. The further I walked, the more I felt like the forest was behind me, closing in. My heart was racing again, and I couldn't get out fast enough. When I finally reached the parking area, I was relieved. I threw my backpack into the car, slammed the door, and locked it. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't need to know who or what had been out there that night. I didn't care anymore. I left the forest behind me, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after. I didn't go camping again for a long time. Every now and then, I still think about that night, the footsteps in the dark, the quiet tension in the air. I don't know what happened, and I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. Sometimes, the woods hold secrets best left unexplored. I never expected that my weekend camping trip would turn into something so terrifying. It all started with the usual excitement of getting away from everything for a few days. I packed my bag carefully, as I always do before a trip: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, flashlight, and a good knife. I'm a seasoned camper, so I knew what to bring. But there's one thing no one ever tells you about the wilderness: how completely isolating it can feel when you're truly alone. I decided to camp in a remote spot. I wanted to avoid the busy trails where people gather. I'd heard about this quiet, lesser-known place deep in the woods, and it sounded perfect. A private spot by a lake where the trees were dense and the ground soft and forgiving. It was a 2-day hike in, so I didn't expect anyone else to be there. This should have been my first red flag. I arrived just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest. The last light was fading quickly, so I hurried to set up my tent. The air was cool, the kind of chill that made you tug your jacket a little tighter around your shoulders. There wasn't much noise around me, just the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot.
No birds singing, no insects buzzing.
The quiet was unnerving, but I pushed that thought aside. It's normal for places like this to feel dead silent. I made my camp quickly, gathering some wood for a fire. I knew the woods could get cold at night, even in summer. The crackle of the fire, once I got it going, was the only sound that filled the air now. It was comforting, almost like a friend, as if the flames were whispering, telling me everything was fine. But deep down, something felt off. I tried to shake the feeling off. I was here to relax, to unwind from the usual grind of life. The day had been long, and my body was tired. So, after a simple meal of beans and trail mix, I zipped myself into the tent, hoping sleep would come quickly. But it didn't. I lay there, listening to the faint sounds outside the tent. Leaves rustling, branches creaking, the occasional snap of a twig. But I couldn't fall asleep. My mind kept wandering. The silence outside was thick, almost too thick. Around midnight, I finally managed to drift off, exhaustion pulling me into a shallow sleep. But that peace didn't last long. I woke suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There was a sound, a deep, unmistakable crack of a branch breaking. I blinked, looking around the tent, trying to make sense of it. I could hear the sound of something heavy moving through the woods, snapping branches with each step. My first thought was that it was a deer or maybe a bear, but it was too loud, too deliberate. I laid still, my breathing shallow, waiting for the noise to stop. But it didn't. Continued closer now. Step, crack, step, crack. Whatever it wasn't trying to be subtle. It was moving toward my campsite. My heart started to race. I told myself it was just an animal, just a bear or something, and that I shouldn't panic. But the sound wasn't right. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard in the woods. It was wrong. Too heavy, too rhythmic. Almost like it was walking in a pattern, as if something was walking deliberately. I slowly reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise. My hand brushed against the cold steel of my knife, and I grabbed it without thinking, holding it tightly in my grip. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to do with it, but something about the situation made me feel like I needed to be ready. The footsteps continued, growing closer, and then they stopped. Just like that. Silence again. I waited, my eyes fixed on the dark outside the tent. Nothing. The fire had died down to embers, casting faint, flickering light on the tent's interior. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, any clue about what was out there. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours, I couldn't tell anymore. The longer the silence lasted, the more I felt like something wasn't right. My mind raced with thoughts. What if it wasn't an animal? What if it was a person? No one else was supposed to be out here. No one knew this place like I did. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent. The cold night air rushed in, making me shiver. I kept my flashlight off, but the moonlight was enough to make out the trees surrounding me. The shadows were long and distorted, the branches twisting in unnatural shapes. I waited for a moment, just listening. The woods were eerily still, too still. Nothing was moving. I stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest. My flashlight was still clutched tightly in my hand, and I pointed it toward the path I had walked in on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, bouncing off the trunks of trees. The ground was soft beneath my boots, the earth moist with the dew of the night. There were no signs of movement, no broken branches, no disturbed ground. I took a few more steps, my breath coming faster now, my mind racing through every possible explanation for the sounds I'd heard. There had to be an explanation. I told myself that. It had to be. I was alone here, and nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Maybe I was just hearing things. But then I saw it. Not far off the path, under the cover of some bushes, there was a large rock. And near it, the ground was disturbed, scratched up, like something had been digging or scraping at it. I bent down, shining my flashlight over the marks. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't the work of animals. It was something else. Something that had been dragging something heavy, maybe. Something that had been moving deliberately. Suddenly, a noise shattered the quiet. It was a rustling sound, but it wasn't the usual rustle of wind or leaves. It was something moving. Something was out there, just beyond the light of my flashlight. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, to get back to the safety of the tent, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like the ground itself was holding me in place. I listened, trying to discern the direction of the sound. It came from the left. Then it stopped. For a brief moment, there was nothing. But then there was a whisper. It was so faint, I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard it. It sounded like a voice, but distorted, like it was muffled by something. My flashlight flicked off for a second, then came back on, but now I could see it clearly. There, just beyond the bushes, something was crouching. Something hunched over in the dark, still as a stone. Couldn't breathe. In an instant, everything inside me screamed to get away, to run, to leave. My feet found the strength to move, and I turned, heading back to the tent. My mind was racing, but all I could think about was getting inside the safety of my tent. I didn't look back. Couldn't. As soon as I zipped myself back into the tent, I held my breath. Every muscle in my body was tense, my heart hammering in my chest. I lay flat on my back, staring up at the fabric above me, praying I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew that I hadn't been. The night dragged on. The sounds outside continued. Slow steps, scratching at the earth, occasional rustling. But nothing came closer. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded, slowly at first, then entirely. I finally fell into a restless sleep, only to wake up at the crack of dawn. The morning light was weak at first, just a pale gray, but it was enough to make me feel safe, or at least safer than I had the night before. The world outside was still, almost unnervingly so. There was no sign of whatever had been out there. No disturbed ground, no broken branches. I packed up my camp quickly, trying to keep my thoughts focused on the task at hand. The sooner I left, the better. As I was getting ready to leave, I couldn't help but look back one last time toward the place where I had seen that figure in the dark. My stomach twisted with dread, but when I looked, there was nothing. Just trees and bushes, undisturbed, like nothing had ever happened. I wasn't sure what had happened, or what that thing was, but one thing was certain: there was no way I was coming back here, ever. I quickly hiked back out of the woods, my steps faster now. The entire time, I felt like someone or something was watching me. That feeling didn't go away, not even once I was safely back at my car. But when I finally drove away, I didn't look back, and I never will. I had always loved camping. There's something about the fresh air, the crackling of the fire, and the way the stars look like they're within reach, just a little too far to touch. I'd been camping every year since I was a kid, but this trip, this one felt different from the start, though I didn't realize it until it was too late. It started out as a simple plan. A long weekend in the woods, just me and my brother, Jack. We'd grown up in the city, but we both enjoyed escaping to the quiet of nature every now and then. We decided to camp out in a small, secluded area by a lake a few hours from home. It wasn't a popular spot, which was exactly what we wanted. No crowds, no loud neighbors, just the peace of the outdoors. We arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows over the trees as we set up camp. It was a typical scene. Jack pitching the tent while I worked on gathering firewood. The lake was calm, the water barely rippling as the occasional breeze stirred the surface. The birds were chirping, and the forest seemed alive in the quiet, subtle way nature has. The fire was crackling and we sat down to eat, the evening chill beginning to creep in. I remember Jack cracking a joke about how we'd survive on canned beans and instant coffee for the next 2 days. We laughed, but the silence of the forest seemed to make everything feel more intense somehow. That's when I noticed it, a rustling in the woods. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The trees were dense around us, and it was probably a branch or some leaves being disturbed. But then the noise stopped. It wasn't the kind of rustling you hear when a squirrel moves through the underbrush or when the wind picks up. It was heavier, like something or someone was moving in the woods deliberately. I stood up from the fire and scanned the trees, but I couldn't see anything. "Hey, did you hear that?" I asked Jack, though I didn't really want to admit I was a little freaked out. "Hear what?" he said, not looking up from his can of beans. He was always the more laid-back one of us. "It sounded like something moving in the trees," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. He shrugged. "Probably a deer or something. It's a forest, man." I didn't argue. I wanted him to be right. The wind picked up again, rustling the branches, and for a moment, I felt foolish for even thinking twice about it. But then the noise came again, louder this time. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a deer. I didn't mention it again, though not to Jack. I didn't want to seem paranoid. We finished dinner in silence, and as the fire died down, I suggested we turn in for the night. The thought of lying in the tent with the forest stretching around us made me feel uneasy, but I didn't want to seem scared. It wasn't like we were in some horror movie. There were no monsters in the woods, just trees, animals, and us. I climbed into the tent first, arranging my sleeping bag. The zipper of the tent made a faint, scratching sound as Jack climbed in after me. We both settled down, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Outside, the fire was just a dying glow, and everything was quiet, too quiet. For a while, I tried to convince myself that I was being ridiculous. That noise from earlier? Just an animal. The weird feeling, probably the isolation. After all, I had camped dozens of times before, and nothing ever happened. But still, there was something about this place. A sense of wrongness that I couldn't shake. The rustling in the trees wasn't natural. It didn't feel like the kind of sounds you hear in the woods. I heard it again. The rustling. It was coming from a different direction now, closer to the tent. My heart started to race. Jack was fast asleep beside me, snoring lightly, oblivious to the growing sense of dread that was creeping through me. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent, my mind racing. What if someone was out there? Someone who had been watching us since we arrived? Someone who knew we were alone? The noise stopped suddenly, as if whatever was out there had heard my thoughts and decided to wait. The quiet was thick and heavy. I tried to calm my breathing, to settle into sleep, but every little sound, every rustle, every snap of a twig had me on edge. It wasn't until well past midnight that I finally fell into a restless sleep. But I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented, hearing the sound again. This time it was louder, closer. I was wide awake now, my body stiff with tension. I lay there, staring at the fabric of the tent as the noise continued, circling us. A slow, deliberate movement like someone or something was pacing around the camp. I wasn't imagining it. The tent was thin, and even though we had zipped it up tightly, the fabric rustled with each movement from outside. My breath caught in my throat. Jack didn't stir, and I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me. I didn't want to wake him. He would probably laugh it off, tell me I was overthinking it. But something felt off. Suddenly, there was a loud thud. Something hit the side of the tent, hard enough to shake it. My heart pounded in my chest. I sat up, staring at the fabric, too terrified to even move. The thud came again, this time from the other side of the tent. Whatever was out there was getting closer. I reached for the flashlight by my side, my hands trembling. I flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The tent was still and silent, but I could feel something just outside the thin fabric watching. I had to know. I had to look. I slowly unzipped the tent, the sound of the zipper somehow louder than it should have been in the thick night air. I held my breath as I peered outside, shining the flashlight into the dark woods. The beam danced over the trees, the underbrush, but nothing was there. It felt like an eternity, but after what seemed like forever, I breathed a sigh of relief. Nothing. Maybe I had just been imagining it all. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was. But then a movement caught my eye. I froze. In the distance, just beyond the edge of the trees, I saw something. A shadow. Tall, human-shaped, standing still and unmoving. My stomach dropped. My mind screamed at me to get Jack, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, staring at the figure that shouldn't have been there. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it moved. I snapped the flashlight off, panicking. My mind raced. Was someone out there? Person? Or worse? Was it someone who had been following us? I shook Jack awake, my voice barely a whisper, but my panic was enough to stir him. "What's going on?" he mumbled, half asleep. "I saw someone outside." I whispered, my voice trembling. "Relax. It's probably just a deer or something," Jack groggily replied, rolling over. I didn't believe him. I knew what I saw. The figure, moving just out of the flashlight's reach, had been too deliberate, too intentional. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, every tiny sound sending my heart into my throat. The morning came and I was exhausted. The sun was just rising, casting its warm light across the lake. Jack was already up, stirring the embers of the campfire from the night before. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said, glancing at me as I climbed out of the tent. "I didn't," I muttered. "I heard something last night. Someone outside the tent." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Dude, you were probably just freaked out by the dark. It happens." I didn't argue with him. It wasn't like I could prove what I saw. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something had been out there, something that had been watching us. We packed up the camp early, eager to get back on the road. But as we walked away from the lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I turned around, the trees seemed to loom closer, as if they were hiding something just beyond my view. We didn't speak much as we made our way back to the car. When we finally reached the trailhead, I felt a strange sense of relief. I'd never been more glad to see a road in my life. As we drove back home, the forest slowly disappearing in the rearview mirror, I couldn't help but feel like we had left something behind, something that wasn't finished. We never spoke about it again, but I know what I saw, and I know it was real. I've always loved camping. There's something about the outdoors, the quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of being away from everything that makes it so peaceful. So when I got the opportunity to go on a solo camping trip in the deep woods near my hometown, I jumped at the chance. No one else could come with me, and I wasn't about to let that stop me. I'd been camping many times before. This was just a little more remote, a little farther into the forest. I figured it would be an adventure. I set up camp late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The trees were thick around me, their branches swaying gently in the wind, the sound of their leaves rustling filling the otherwise silent woods. I had found a small clearing that seemed perfect for a tent. It was quiet, isolated, exactly what I wanted. The forest seemed to swallow the light as the sun set, leaving me with just the flickering of my campfire to keep the darkness at bay. As I sat there, staring into the fire, I realized how isolated I truly was. The crackling of the flames was the only sound, and it felt almost too loud in the vast silence of the woods. I wasn't scared, though. In fact, I felt a sense of calm. The isolation was comforting. I could see the stars now, high above the treetops, the night sky clear and wide. The air was crisp, cool against my skin, but not uncomfortable. Everything felt right. I spent a while just sitting there, enjoying the stillness. I hadn't expected anyone else to be out here. This was a pretty remote area, not a typical campsite. That's part of the reason I picked it. The only thing I had to worry about was maybe a bear or something like that. But I was prepared. I had the necessary gear. A bear canister for food, a strong tent, a good sleeping bag. But then, as the night wore on, I started to notice something strange. At first, it was small, a rustling sound in the bushes just outside the reach of the firelight. It was too far away to be any kind of animal I recognized, and the wind wasn't strong enough to explain it. My first thought was that maybe it was a deer or something larger, but the sound didn't make sense. The rustling wasn't consistent like the movements of an animal. It was sporadic, almost like something or someone was shifting around in the dark. I tried to brush it off. It's probably just my mind playing tricks on me. I stood up, stretched, and decided to fetch more firewood. The woods were still eerily quiet. No sounds of birds or animals, no wind through the trees, just my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. When I returned to the campfire, I glanced around the clearing again. The rustling hadn't stopped, but it seemed closer now. My heartbeat picked up, and a small pit began to form in my stomach. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. It wasn't the first time I'd heard something strange in the woods. I stoked the fire, throwing a few more logs on to make sure it stayed bright. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was no logical reason for it, but the sound of rustling had taken on a rhythm now, like something was moving, circling the camp. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the woods in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the dark, revealing only trees, their shadows stretching long and thin across the ground. There was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The night grew deeper, and the shadows around me seemed to stretch and shift. I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder every now and then. The rustling was still there, but now it seemed to come from every direction. I told myself it was just the wind, but the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't until the first loud snap that I jumped out of my skin. Something had broken a branch just beyond the edge of the clearing. It sounded like a heavy footstep. I stood up, my heart racing. My mind was racing too, trying to rationalize what was happening. There had to be some logical explanation. Maybe a person was out here too, another camper. But why would they be so close to my camp without making themselves known? And why was I hearing the movement from multiple directions now? It didn't make sense. I grabbed my knife, the only weapon I had on me, and crept quietly to the edge of the clearing. My flashlight's beam bounced shakily across the undergrowth, making the shadows seem even more alive. That's when I heard it again. The rustling was no longer sporadic. It was almost rhythmic, deliberate, moving closer and closer to the edge of the clearing. My pulse quickened, my fingers tight on the handle of the knife. The sound came from the left, and I spun toward it, flashlight aimed. I saw nothing. The rustling stopped for a moment, and I stood there, frozen, listening to the silence. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, my thoughts racing. I took a slow step back toward the campfire, trying to remain calm. Whatever it was out there, I didn't want to provoke it. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl. Not a bear's growl, but something deeper, almost human in its pitch. I froze. The growl came again, closer now. I didn't even think. My legs moved before my mind caught up. I sprinted back to the campfire, grabbed my pack, and threw everything into it. The flashlight flickered as I turned in a circle, looking for anything, anyone, In the dark, a figure moved in the shadows, just outside the reach of the firelight. For a brief moment, I thought I saw someone, standing there, but it was gone before I could focus on it. The growl came again, and this time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my gear and ran. I ran deeper into the woods, away from the clearing, away from whatever was out there. My mind was frantic, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The woods were thick, the underbrush grabbing at my legs, slowing me down. I stumbled, tripped, but kept going. Couldn't stop. Whatever that was, whatever it wanted, I wasn't about to wait around to find out. I kept running, and when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when my legs burned with exhaustion, I finally reached a small stream. The water was shallow, but it would make it harder for anyone or anything to follow my scent. I crouched there, listening, waiting for the sounds of movement behind me. Nothing. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening to the night around me. The rustling was gone, the growling silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. Eventually, I made my way back to the trailhead, still on edge, still listening for any sign of movement. It wasn't until I finally reached my car, breathing heavily, that I felt like I could relax, like I was truly safe. But even now, as I drive home, I can't stop thinking about it, about the growl, about the figure I saw, if it was even real. The woods were never supposed to be this unnerving. I had camped out in remote places before, and I had always felt safe. But not this time. I'm not going back there. Not ever. Whatever it was out there, whatever I encountered, I don't want to know. I'm done with that place. I'm done with those woods. I never thought camping could be so unsettling. It was supposed to be just a quick weekend getaway, a way to escape the noise of the city, to find some peace and quiet in the woods. A few buddies and I had decided to hike out to a small, remote campsite that we'd seen marked on a map. It wasn't a popular spot, too far off the beaten path, too many steep hills, and not much water nearby, but it seemed perfect for our little adventure. We drove out Friday night, pulling up to the trailhead in the dark. The trees loomed high above us, their twisted branches casting long, strange shadows across the dirt road. The air smelled fresh, but there was something else to it too. Something faintly musty, like old wood and damp earth. My friends joked about the creepy vibes and laughed, but I could feel the tension creeping up on me. We grabbed our gear from the back of the truck, tents, sleeping bags, food, and all the usual stuff, and started our hike in the dim light of our flashlights. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places with thick underbrush on either side. Every crack of a twig or rustling in the leaves made me jump, even though I tried to laugh it off. It was just the woods, right? Nothing to be afraid of. The deeper we went, the more isolated it felt. We walked in silence for a while, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The only sounds the soft crunch of our boots on the dirt trail and the occasional bird call from somewhere high up in the trees. By the time we reached the campsite, it was well past midnight. The site was tucked in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, the ground covered in a thick layer of fallen needles. A small creek bubbled nearby, its water running fast and clear in the dark. It looked peaceful enough, but there was something off about it. The trees felt too close, almost like they were leaning in, watching us. We set up camp quickly, each of us eager to settle in after the long hike. The tent went up without issue. The fire was started with just a couple of matches, and soon enough we were sitting around it, toasting marshmallows and talking about the hike ahead. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, and I tried to push away the growing unease gnawing at the back of my mind. I had a strange feeling that we were being watched. The wind had died down, and the silence was almost suffocating. I kept scanning the trees around us, but there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. After a while, we decided to turn in for the night. We piled into the tents, zipped ourselves in, and tried to get some sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The air inside the tent was thick and damp, and every little noise made me jerk awake. The creaking of branches, the distant rustle of leaves. I couldn't tell if I was hearing things or if something was really out there. I finally dozed off, but I kept waking up, unable to get a good night's sleep. Each time I opened my eyes, it felt like something had changed. The shadows outside the tent seemed darker, deeper, more oppressive. The night stretched on, and the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Around 4 a.m., I woke up with a start. There was a noise outside. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was too deliberate, too human. I held my breath, straining to listen. There were footsteps, slow, uneven, like someone was walking around the campsite. Not the kind of wandering someone might do while looking for firewood or a bathroom, but the kind of careful steps that made you feel like you were being hunted. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't want to wake my friends. I wasn't sure if I even wanted them to know. The last thing I needed was to be called paranoid. So, I lay there, trying to ignore the footsteps, telling myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably nothing. But the footsteps continued. They circled the camp, then stopped, only to start again, this time closer to my tent. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves beneath someone's shoes. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I stayed as still as possible, trying not to make a sound, not knowing what else to do. My breathing was shallow, and I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps got closer. Then there was a long pause, the kind of pause that makes you think maybe something is listening too. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen, waiting for the next movement, but when it came, it wasn't what I expected. A soft tap on the side of my tent. Barely a tap, really, more like a light nudge. Couldn't breathe. My mind raced. Was someone standing right outside? I wasn't sure if I should peek out of the tent or just stay quiet and hope it would go away. But the nudge didn't go away. The fabric of the tent moved slightly, as if someone was pressing up against it. My heart was hammering in my chest now, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. There was a voice in my head telling me to stay calm, that it could be an animal, or even one of my friends playing a prank. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't either of those things. The pressure against the tent increased, and I held my breath. I tried to think of what to do, but my mind was blank. The feeling of being trapped in there was suffocating. Finally, the pressure let up, and I heard the steps retreating. Slowly, cautiously, as if the person, or whatever it was, didn't want to make too much noise. I didn't move for what felt like forever. Couldn't. I just lay there, heart racing, ears straining to hear any sound that would confirm I was imagining things. But there was nothing now, just the sound of my own breathing. I didn't sleep again that night. I kept hearing little sounds, distant crunches, whispers in the wind, the occasional rustle of leaves, but nothing close enough to confirm what had happened. When the first light of dawn finally crept over the horizon, I unzipped the tent, ready to pack up and leave. But when I stepped outside, I was hit with the smell of something off. It wasn't just the fresh morning air anymore. There was a sharp, metallic scent in the air, like rust or blood. I looked around the campsite, but nothing was out of place. No signs of any animal or person. I called out to my friends, but when they emerged from their tents, they were as disoriented as I was. They hadn't heard anything strange, hadn't felt the presence I had. They seemed fine, a little groggy, but nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't tell them what had happened. They would have thought I was losing it, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. We packed up camp and started the hike back out of the woods, trying to push the unease to the back of our minds. The forest, though, felt different now. The trees were taller, more oppressive. The trail seemed to go on longer than it had the night before. My eyes kept flicking over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the shadows, but there was nothing. When we finally made it back to the truck, the sense of relief was overwhelming. We threw our gear in the bed, slammed the tailgate shut, and I slid into the driver's seat, eager to put the woods behind me. As we drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something watching us. But the road was empty, the trees far behind us. We never went back to that campsite, and I don't think I ever will.